A heavy, unnatural stillness settled over Paris as midnight approached on Friday, October 13, 1307. The streets were darker than usual, the taverns quieter, the air thick with the sense that something unseen was moving through the city. Doors were shut, candles burned low. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the passing hours, indifferent to the fate about to unfold. Then came the torches. Lines of armed men moved through the narrow streets with practiced precision, their boots striking stone in near-perfect unison. Royal banners fluttered in the firelight, unmistakable in their authority. These were not drunken guards or local watchmen. These were soldiers of the king, carrying sealed orders that had been delivered across France at the same hour, under strict command that they not be opened until this very night. Inside the envelopes lay a single instruction: arrest every Knight Templar. The men they were coming for were no ordinary monks. They were warriors bound by sacred oaths, bankers to kings, custodians of vast wealth, and symbols of both faith and fear. For nearly 2 centuries, the Knights Templar had stood at the center of Christendom's most dangerous ambitions, sworn to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, yet operating far beyond the battlefield. Their white mantles and red crosses had become icons of power, devotion, and mystery. Now, in a single coordinated strike, they were to be erased. Temple doors were forced open. Brothers were dragged from their beds, some still in prayer, others barely awake. Shackles replaced swords. Accusations were read aloud in trembling voices. Heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, secret rituals, denial of Christ. The words sounded rehearsed, almost hollow, as if even the accusers did not fully understand what they were saying. Some Templars resisted. Most did not. They had sworn obedience, after all. Many believed this was a misunderstanding that would be resolved by the Church. Others sensed, in that instant, that something far darker was at work, because heresy alone did not explain the scale of what was happening. Across France, hundreds of arrests unfolded simultaneously. No warnings, no trials, no chance to flee. It was a level of coordination unseen in medieval Europe, a precision strike designed not merely to punish, but to annihilate. Records would later claim the Templars had become corrupt, greedy, morally rotten. But corruption does not require silence. Corruption does not require secrecy at this scale. And corruption does not terrify kings. King Philip IV of France, known even in his own time as the Fair, watched the operation unfold from the safety of his palace. He was a man drowning in debt, much of it owed to the very order he was now destroying. But money alone does not explain the risk he was taking. To move against the Templars was to challenge not only a military order, but the authority of the Pope himself. Unless Philip knew something the public did not. Unless the Templars possessed something that could not be allowed to survive. As the arrests continued, whispers followed. Prison guards spoke of strange confessions extracted under torture, of idols with bearded faces, of secret names for God, of rituals conducted in darkness, far from the eyes of Rome. These stories spread quickly, feeding the narrative that the order had lost its way. But beneath the rumors, a deeper question pulsed like a hidden heartbeat. Why now? The Templars had existed for generations. If they were heretics, why had the Church tolerated them for nearly 200 years? If they were corrupt, why strike with such sudden, absolute force? And if their crimes were spiritual, why did kings and lawyers take the lead, rather than priests? The answer may lie not in what the Templars were accused of doing, but in what they were believed to know. Long before their fall, the Knights Templar had been something unusual among medieval orders. They were not confined to monasteries. They moved freely between East and West, between Christian and Muslim lands, between battlefields and ancient ruins. Their headquarters in Jerusalem had been established on one of the most contested and symbolically charged sites on earth, the Temple Mount. For years, they lived and worked there in relative isolation. Officially, they guarded pilgrims. Unofficially, legends claim they dug. What they might have been digging for was never recorded in church documents. But absence of evidence does not mean absence of activity, especially when those activities were never meant to be seen. Jerusalem is a city built atop layers of older civilizations, each resting on the bones of the last. Beneath its stones lie forgotten chambers, sealed tunnels, and relics far older than Christianity, older even than Judaism. If the Templars uncovered something there, something ancient, powerful, and incompatible with church doctrine, it would explain much. It would explain their sudden rise in wealth and influence. It would explain the strange symbolism that later appeared in their seals and architecture. And it would explain why their enemies did not merely want them defeated, but silenced. As dawn approached on that October morning, the damage was already done. The Order's leadership was imprisoned, its assets seized, its reputation shattered beyond repair. Over the following years, torture would extract confessions that sounded increasingly bizarre, contradictory, and rehearsed. Many Templars recanted as soon as the pain stopped. Others died without ever speaking. One man, Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Order, would survive long enough to publicly withdraw his confession, declaring the Templars innocent before being burned alive in 1314. His final words echoed across Europe, a dying curse against king and pope alike. Within a year, both would be dead. History would later portray the fall of the Templars as a tragic collision of greed, politics, and fear. But that explanation feels incomplete. Too neat, too comfortable. Empires do not move with such precision over simple debts or vague accusations. They move when something fundamental is threatened. Tonight, as we stand at the edge of this story, one truth is already clear. The destruction of the Knights Templar was not the end of a chapter. It was the sealing of one. Whatever they discovered, whatever they carried in silence, was deemed too dangerous for the medieval world to confront openly. And if that secret truly was ancient, older than the Church, older than the Bible, older even than Jerusalem itself, then the real question is not why the Templars were destroyed. It is why their knowledge was never meant to be revealed. Long before they were hunted, before their name became synonymous with conspiracy and forbidden knowledge, the Knights Templar were little more than a desperate idea born in the aftermath of bloodshed. The year was 1119. Jerusalem had fallen to Christian forces only 2 decades earlier, wrested from Muslim control at an almost unimaginable human cost. The Crusades, preached as holy wars, had left the region soaked in blood and resentment. Pilgrims from Europe poured into the Holy Land, driven by faith, fear, and the promise of salvation. Many never made it past the roads outside the city. Bandits, mercenaries, and displaced fighters preyed on travelers who had little more than a staff and a prayer to protect them. It was in this fragile, violent landscape that a small group of knights approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a radical proposal. They would renounce personal wealth, take monastic vows, and dedicate their lives to protecting pilgrims on the road. They asked for no pay, no titles, and no lands, only permission to serve. At the center of this group was a man named Hugues de Payens. Little is known about him, and that absence is telling. Medieval chroniclers recorded the deeds of kings and conquerors in obsessive detail, yet the founder of what would become Europe's most powerful military order emerges from history almost like a shadow. What we do know is that he and his companions took vows of poverty so severe that, according to early accounts, 2 knights were said to share a single horse. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. The name was not symbolic. It was literal. For nearly a decade, the group remained obscure. There were no grand battles, no dramatic expansions, no signs of future greatness. They wore simple clothing, carried outdated weapons, and survived on donations. Many in Jerusalem likely saw them as an oddity, pious men playing at knighthood in a land that devoured the unprepared. Yet something remarkable happened during those quiet years. King Baldwin granted them quarters not in a monastery, but within the royal complex built atop the ruins of the ancient Temple of Solomon. To medieval Christians, this location carried immense symbolic weight. To historians, it raises far more complicated questions. Why place a newly formed, untested order of knights at the most sensitive religious site in the city? The official explanation was convenience. The deeper implications were never discussed. As the years passed, the Templars, now known by the name of their residents, began to change. Their numbers grew slowly but steadily. Their discipline hardened. Their identity crystallized around a strange fusion of monastic obedience and military readiness. They prayed like monks, fought like knights, and answered only to their own internal hierarchy. Then, in 1129, everything accelerated. At the Council of Troyes in France, the order received formal recognition from the Church. Their rule was drafted with the help of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures of the age. Bernard did not merely approve the Templars, he glorified them. In his writings, he described them as a new kind of warrior, one who killed without sin and died without fear. This endorsement transformed the order overnight. Nobles across Europe rushed to support them. Lands were donated. Sons were sent to join. Money flowed into Templar coffers from every corner of Christendom. What had once been a handful of impoverished knights became an institution with estates, fortresses, and influence stretching from England to the Levant. But even as their power grew, the Templars remained different. Unlike other orders, they answered to no king. Unlike bishops, they answered to no local authority. They reported directly to the Pope, placing them outside the reach of secular law. Their internal records were sealed, their rituals private, their movements often unexplained. To the medieval mind, secrecy was unsettling. To kings, it was dangerous. Still, their reputation remained largely untarnished. On the battlefield, they earned a fearsome name. Templars were known to fight to the death rather than retreat. Muslim chroniclers wrote of their discipline with a mixture of respect and dread. They became symbols of Christian resolve, immovable and relentless. Yet this image of holy warriors does not fully explain their rapid ascent. Other orders fought bravely. None accumulated wealth like the Templars. By the mid-12th century, the order had become the financial backbone of Europe's crusading efforts. They developed early forms of banking, allowing pilgrims and nobles to deposit funds in one location and withdraw them in another. Kings trusted them with treasuries. The Church entrusted them with taxes. Even their enemies acknowledged their organizational brilliance. But innovation alone does not account for the almost supernatural confidence placed in them. People believed the Templars were protected, favored, chosen. Their symbols reinforced this belief. The red cross they wore was not merely an emblem of sacrifice. It was a mark of belonging to something set apart from ordinary society. Their seals depicted strange imagery. Two knights on one horse, not just as a reminder of poverty, but as a statement of unity and secrecy. One body, one purpose, one hidden truth. As the order expanded, subtle shifts became noticeable. Their architecture incorporated unusual proportions. Their chapels deviated from standard designs. Their fortresses were not just defensive structures, but precise, almost mathematical creations. These details were easy to overlook, but they suggested a guiding knowledge beyond simple military engineering. Knowledge, perhaps, acquired during those early, undocumented years in Jerusalem. It is here that the story begins to whisper rather than speak. Because while chroniclers praised their victories and donors recorded their generosity, no one wrote about what the Templars did during their first decade beneath the Temple Mount. No inventories, no excavation records, no official church oversight. For 9 years, they existed in a sacred space layered atop centuries of buried history, and left no written trace of their activities. Silence in history is rarely accidental. By the time the Templars emerged as a dominant force, they were no longer merely poor knights guarding pilgrims. They were custodians of something intangible but potent: authority, confidence, a sense of purpose that went beyond vows and battle. And that is what unsettled their contemporaries most. They were not afraid in the way other men were afraid. They did not cling to land or lineage. They behaved as if the future was already known to them, as if their role in history had been revealed in advance. This was the paradox at the heart of the order. Outwardly humble, inwardly unshakable. Publicly devout, privately inscrutable. They embodied the perfect image of Christian obedience, yet moved with the autonomy of those who answer to a higher, perhaps older, law. By the end of the 12th century, the Knights Templar were everywhere. On battlefields, in courts, in marketplaces, They had become essential to the functioning of medieval Europe. And yet, no one truly understood who they were anymore. Not even the church that had once embraced them so eagerly. The transformation from poverty to power was complete. But transformations always leave traces. And the deeper historians look, the more it appears that the Templars' rise was not fueled solely by faith, discipline, or clever finance. It was fueled by something they carried with them from the very beginning. Something born in silence, beneath ancient stones, in a place where empires had buried their gods and their secrets alike. And if their fall would one day shock the world, their rise should have warned it. For nearly a decade, the Knights Templar lived in the heart of Jerusalem, yet left behind almost nothing that explains what they truly did there. From the outside, their existence seemed simple. A small brotherhood of warrior monks housed within the former royal complex of King Baldwin II, praying, training, and guarding pilgrims. But Jerusalem is not a city that allows simplicity. Every stone rests atop another story, every sacred space layered with the remnants of older beliefs. And the place the Templars were given was no ordinary residence. They were housed on the Temple Mount. To medieval Christians, this was the site of Solomon's Temple, the holiest structure of the Old Testament. To Jews, it was the heart of divine presence. To Muslims, it was the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. And to historians, archaeologists, and esoteric scholars, it was something even more unsettling. A convergence point of civilizations stretching back thousands of years. Long before Solomon, the plateau had been shaped, cut, and hollowed by unknown hands. Subterranean chambers, sealed corridors, and massive stone foundations hinted at activity far older than biblical timelines comfortably allow. This was not just a religious site, it was a palimpsest of forgotten knowledge. The Templars were placed directly on top of it. Official records tell us little beyond their residence in the Al-Aqsa complex, which Crusaders mistakenly identified as Solomon's Temple. But what the records omit is far more striking than what they include. For 9 years, from their founding in 1119 until their recognition in 1129, the order operated in near-total obscurity. No sermons, no detailed correspondence, no oversight from Rome. It is within this silence that speculation begins, but speculation does not arise without reason. Accounts from later centuries, filtered through legend and hostility, claim the Templars were digging. Not casually, not randomly, but methodically. Beneath the Temple Mount, where ancient retaining walls concealed deep vaults and hidden passageways, they are said to have searched for something specific. Not treasure, knowledge. The very idea unsettled medieval chroniclers. Excavation beneath holy ground was dangerous, even blasphemous. But the Templars were not ordinary monks. They had royal protection, they had autonomy, and they had time. Jerusalem's underground world was vast. Roman engineers had expanded earlier tunnels. Herodian builders had reinforced them. Islamic rulers had sealed and repurposed them. By the 12th century, much of what lay beneath the Temple Mount was forgotten even to those who lived above it. If something had been hidden there, something intentionally buried and deliberately erased, it would have been protected not by guards but by ignorance. The legends that followed the Templars' stay in Jerusalem point again and again to a small set of possibilities. The Ark of the Covenant, lost scrolls, sacred relics of the First Temple. But these ideas may be distractions, later attempts to frame the unknown in familiar terms. Ancient knowledge is rarely stored as objects. It is stored as systems, symbols, instructions. Egyptian temples, centuries earlier, had used architecture itself as a form of encoded teaching. Walls aligned to stars, chambers designed to induce altered states, ritual movement through space as a path to transformation. If similar principles were embedded beneath the Temple Mount, carried forward, altered, hidden, it would explain why so many traditions converged there, and why someone might want to recover what remained. The Templars were uniquely positioned to recognize such significance. Unlike most European knights, they lived alongside Muslim and Jewish scholars. They encountered Arabic translations of Greek philosophy. They were exposed to mathematical, astronomical, and mystical traditions far more advanced than those taught in Europe at the time. This cultural proximity mattered, because in the Islamic world, fragments of ancient Egyptian and Hellenistic knowledge had survived, preserved through scholarship rather than dogma. Concepts of sacred geometry, harmonic proportion, and cosmic order were still actively studied. Ideas long abandoned or suppressed in the Christian West were alive and evolving just beyond its borders. If the Templars learned to recognize the fingerprints of this knowledge, they may have known exactly what to look for beneath the Temple Mount. And if they found it, they would not have announced it. What follows in the historical record is not evidence of discovery, but evidence of change. After their time in Jerusalem, the Templars did not behave like an order that had simply matured. They behaved like one that had been transformed. Their internal discipline intensified, their confidence sharpened, their sense of mission expanded beyond the immediate goal of protecting pilgrims. They began to build. Across Europe and the Levant, Templar structures appeared with unusual consistency. Round churches modeled not on local tradition, but on a specific geometry, echoes of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and perhaps something older still. Their fortresses were positioned not just strategically, but symbolically, aligned with landscapes in ways that suggested intention beyond warfare. These were not the decisions of men improvising. They were the decisions of men following a blueprint. One of the most telling details is the Templars' sudden reverence for certain symbols that had little grounding in mainstream Christian teaching. Light as divine principle, balance as sacred law. The idea that the structure of the universe could be known, not just believed. Such ideas would later be condemned as heretical. But they were not foreign. They were ancient. In Egypt, the concept of Ma'at governed both cosmos and conscience. Truth, balance, order. Not imposed by a god, but embodied in the structure of reality itself. To live in harmony with it was to align with the divine. To violate it was to invite chaos. This philosophy did not require priests as intermediaries. It required understanding. If remnants of this worldview had been absorbed into early Hebrew thought, and then buried beneath layers of theology and law, the Temple Mount would have been the perfect place to conceal it. And the Templars, operating in a rare moment of access and autonomy, may have been the last ones able to retrieve it. What makes this possibility so unsettling is not that the Templars found ancient knowledge, but that they seemed to know how dangerous it was. There are no triumphant proclamations in their history, no claims of revelation, no new doctrine announced. Instead, there is restraint, silence, compartmentalization. Knowledge, if it existed, was kept within the order, passed quietly, symbolically, perhaps only partially. This was not hoarding. It was containment. By the time the Templars left Jerusalem following the Muslim reconquest in 1187, they carried something with them that could not be taken by force. Something that reshaped their identity long after the city itself was lost. The Temple Mount faded from Christian control, but its influence followed the order across continents. In stone, in symbol, in behavior, and centuries later, when their enemies searched for evidence of corruption, they found only fragments, enough to inspire fear, but not enough to explain it. Perhaps that was the point, because if the Templars had uncovered a truth that challenged the very foundation of medieval Christianity, the safest place to hide it would not have been in a book or a relic. It would have been in the structure of their order itself. And the silence that surrounds those 9 years beneath the Temple Mount may not be a gap in the record at all, but a deliberate act of preservation. A sealed chamber in history, waiting to be reopened. To understand what truly lingered beneath Jerusalem, one must look far beyond the city itself, beyond the Crusades, beyond the Bible, beyond even the rise of Israel. The shadow that stretches across the Temple Mount does not originate in medieval Europe or ancient Judah. It reaches back to the banks of the Nile, to a civilization that shaped sacred space with a precision and intention the world would not see again for millennia. Long before Jerusalem became holy to 3 faiths, Egypt had already mastered the art of encoding belief into stone. Temples were not merely places of worship. They were instruments designed to teach, transform, and initiate. Every wall, corridor, and chamber was part of a larger system meant to guide the human mind toward an understanding of cosmic order. This knowledge was not meant for everyone. Egyptian society was structured around initiation. Priests did not simply preach doctrines. They guarded processes. Sacred truths were revealed in stages, each one earned through discipline, silence, and moral preparation. To speak openly of these teachings was forbidden, not because they were fragile, but because they were powerful. Power, in this context, did not mean control over others. It meant mastery over oneself. Central to this worldview was the belief that the divine was not distant or external, but embedded within the structure of reality itself. The universe followed laws that could be observed, understood, and aligned with. Harmony was not enforced by fear of punishment, but by awareness of consequence. This was the essence of Ma'at, the balance that governed stars and souls alike. When Egypt's political power faded, this philosophy did not vanish. It migrated. Trade routes, conquests, and cultural exchange carried fragments of Egyptian sacred science into the wider Mediterranean world. Greek philosophers studied in Egypt and returned home transformed. Pythagoras, Plato, and others absorbed ideas about geometry, harmony, and the soul that would later be labeled Greek, though their roots lay firmly in the Nile Valley. These ideas did not spread openly. They were absorbed into mystery schools, passed down through allegory and symbol, often stripped of their original context. Over time, their origins blurred, but their influence remained. Jerusalem was one of the places where these currents converged. The region that would become Israel sat at the crossroads of empires. Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, all left their mark. The biblical narrative itself acknowledges periods of deep Egyptian influence, none more significant than the Exodus story. Yet what that story omits may be as important as what it includes. Moses, according to the tradition, was raised in the Egyptian court. That alone is extraordinary. He would have been educated not only in administration and warfare, but in Egyptian cosmology, ritual, and sacred symbolism. The laws he later delivered to his people did not emerge in a vacuum. They bear structural similarities to older Egyptian moral codes, simplified, externalized, and reframed for a tribal society. What was once an internal path of alignment became an external system of commandments. This transformation may have been intentional. Ancient teachings often adapted themselves to the needs of the people receiving them. What could be entrusted to a trained priesthood in Egypt might have been dangerous in a newly formed nation struggling for identity and survival. But adaptation often leaves remnants. Jerusalem's earliest sacred architecture reflects this layered inheritance. The dimensions, orientations, and symbolic elements attributed to Solomon's temple echo design principles that predate Israelite religion. The emphasis on light, proportion, and controlled access mirrors older Egyptian and Near Eastern temple traditions, where movement through space was meant to mirror spiritual progression. The inner sanctum was not simply forbidden, it was prepared. Over centuries, as religions hardened and doctrines solidified, these subtler meanings were obscured. The temple became a political and religious symbol rather than an initiatory space. Its mysteries, once lived and practiced, were codified into law and ritual. Then it was destroyed, and rebuilt, and destroyed again. Each cycle buried more than stone. It buried context, meaning, memory. By the time the Templars arrived in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount was already a layered archive of forgotten ideas. The Crusaders saw it through a biblical lens, but that lens was incomplete. Beneath their theology lay structures shaped by minds that understood sacred space differently. The Templars were not scholars in the modern sense, but they were observant. And more importantly, they were present at a moment when boundaries between cultures were unusually porous. They encountered Muslim scholars who preserved Greek and Egyptian knowledge. They interacted with Jewish mystics whose traditions retained echoes of older symbolic systems. The Egyptian shadow did not announce itself. It lingered in symbols, numbers, and orientations, in the idea that divine truth could be approached through understanding rather than submission. This idea was deeply unsettling to medieval Christianity. The Church's authority rested on mediation. God spoke through priests, sacraments, and scripture. Salvation was administered, not discovered. Any philosophy suggesting that humans could directly access divine order through knowledge threatened the entire structure of power. Yet that was precisely the philosophy that Egyptian sacred science proposed. If the Templars encountered evidence of this worldview beneath the Temple Mount, or recognized its patterns embedded in ancient foundations, they would have faced a profound dilemma. To reveal such knowledge would invite accusations of heresy. To ignore it would betray their sense of purpose. So they did neither. They absorbed it. The Order's later behavior suggests a subtle but decisive shift. Their spirituality became inwardly focused, disciplined, almost austere. Their emphasis on obedience masked a deeper independence. They followed rules but not blindly. They valued structure, geometry, and balance in ways that transcended Christian symbolism. Their buildings spoke quietly. Their rituals hinted rather than declared. Their silence became their shield. Egyptian influence, by this stage, was no longer recognizable as Egyptian. It had been transformed, translated, and filtered through centuries of reinterpretation. But its core principles remained intact. Knowledge as liberation, balance as divine law, silence as protection. Jerusalem was not the origin of this knowledge. It was a crossroads where fragments resurfaced, briefly visible to those who knew how to see them. The Templars may not have understood every aspect of what they encountered. But understanding was not the point. Recognition was. They recognized that something ancient had survived, hidden beneath layers of faith and conquest. And they recognized that the world they lived in was not ready to confront it. The Egyptian shadow, once cast, does not fade easily. It stretches across cultures, adapting its shape but preserving its essence. In Jerusalem, it lay dormant beneath sacred ground. In the Templars, it found new custodians, men bound by silence, discipline, and a willingness to carry a burden they could never openly explain. What followed would not be an explosion of revelation, but a slow, deliberate transmission. Not through texts but through form, through stone, through symbol, through behavior. The shadow would move westward with them, quietly influencing the future while remaining invisible to those who only looked at the surface of history. And by the time their enemies finally struck, they were not destroying an order that had lost its way. They were confronting one that had found something it was never meant to reveal. It was not gathered for curiosity, nor shared freely for the sake of enlightenment. Knowledge was power in its purest form, and like all power, it was guarded with care, ritual, and fear. To understand what may have survived into later ages, and why it was so dangerous, one must step inside the world of the Egyptian priesthood, where learning was inseparable from control, and revelation was earned only through transformation. Egyptian temples were not churches in the modern sense. They were not places where ordinary people gathered to hear sermons or receive moral instruction. They were restricted complexes, closed to the uninitiated, designed to separate the sacred from the profane. The deeper one moved into a temple, the fewer people were permitted to follow. At the very center stood chambers that only the highest-ranking priests could enter, spaces where knowledge was not spoken but enacted. What these priests guarded was not merely mythology. They guarded an understanding of how the universe was ordered, and how human consciousness fit within it. The Egyptians believed that reality operated according to immutable principles. The movements of stars, the cycles of the Nile, the rhythm of birth and decay were not random acts of divine will, but expressions of cosmic law. These laws could be observed, measured, and harmonized with. To live rightly was not to obey commandments, but to align oneself with this underlying order. This alignment was Ma'at. Ma'at was truth, balance, justice, and harmony, but not as abstract ideals. It was a force woven into existence itself. Every action either upheld it or disrupted it. The gods themselves were subject to it. Even the pharaoh, considered divine, ruled only so long as he maintained Ma'at. This idea alone was revolutionary. It meant that no god, no ruler, no priest stood above cosmic law. Authority was conditional. Power was accountable. And human beings, through understanding and discipline, could participate consciously in the maintenance of universal order. Such a belief could not be allowed to spread unchecked. So it was wrapped in layers of symbolism, ritual, and secrecy. Egyptian religious texts were written in multiple registers: public hymns for the masses, symbolic narratives for the educated, and esoteric instructions reserved for initiates. The same story could be read as myth, morality, or manual, depending on who was reading. Death itself was treated as an initiation. The famous Egyptian concern with the afterlife was not simply fear of mortality. It was preparation. The soul, they believed, would be judged not by belief but by balance. The heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, not metaphorically but morally. A life lived in ignorance, imbalance, or excess could not pass. Salvation, therefore, was not granted. It was achieved. This placed enormous emphasis on self-knowledge. One had to know oneself, one's actions, one's alignment with cosmic order. Rituals, chants, and temple journeys were not acts of worship in the modern sense, but psychological and spiritual training, designed to reshape perception and awareness. To medieval Christianity, this idea would have been profoundly threatening. Christian doctrine emphasized faith over knowledge, obedience over understanding, grace over alignment. The divine was external, personal, and authoritative. God ruled, humans submitted. Salvation came through belief and sacraments administered by the Church. Egyptian sacred science inverted this relationship. It suggested that divinity was impersonal, structural, and accessible, that gods were expressions of cosmic principles rather than absolute rulers, and that human beings, through discipline and insight, could approach the divine without intermediaries. This was not atheism. It was something far more destabilizing, because if such knowledge were true, or even partially true, it would undermine every institution built on exclusive access to God. The Egyptian priesthood understood this danger well. That is why initiation was gradual and selective. Not everyone was meant to know everything. Knowledge without preparation could unbalance the mind, disrupt society, or inspire rebellion. Forbidden knowledge in Egypt was not forbidden because it was evil, but because it was potent. Astronomy, for example, was not studied merely to predict seasons. It was a sacred science. Temples were aligned with stars not as decoration, but as teaching tools. The heavens were seen as a map of divine order, mirrored within the human soul. To understand the stars was to understand oneself. Geometry, too, was sacred. Proportions used in temples reflected harmonic relationships believed to govern both music and the cosmos. These ratios were not aesthetic preferences. They were statements about reality. When Egypt's political dominance collapsed, this system did not disappear overnight. But without centralized power, the priesthood fractured. Some knowledge was absorbed into Greek philosophy. Some was diluted into myth. Some was hidden deliberately, preserved by small circles who understood its implications. And some was buried. The Near East became a crossroads of these fragments. Ideas moved disguised as stories, laws, and symbols. What could no longer be taught directly was encoded. Over generations, the code was misunderstood, reinterpreted, or reduced to ritual without comprehension. By the time of ancient Israel, many of these ideas had been transformed beyond recognition but not erased. The biblical emphasis on law, order, and covenant echoes Egyptian concepts of cosmic balance, stripped of their philosophical depth and recast in moral terms. The Ark of the Covenant, with its specific dimensions, materials, and restrictions, resembles earlier Egyptian ritual objects far more than later Christian relics. Even the structure of the tabernacle mirrors older sacred geometry. These similarities do not require conspiracy. They require contact. And contact there was. Egypt dominated the Levant for centuries. Its administrative systems, religious ideas, and symbolic language permeated the region. The people who would later define themselves as separate did so while carrying cultural inheritance they no longer recognized as foreign. This is how forbidden knowledge survives, not as intact systems, but as fossils embedded in new belief structures. By the medieval period, the Church had little patience for ambiguity. Doctrine was fixed. Truth was declared. Mystery was tolerated only when it reinforced authority. Anything suggesting that truth could be discovered independently, through knowledge or inner transformation, was suspect, heretical, demonic even, and yet, the remnants of Egyptian sacred science still lingered, in symbols, numbers, architectural forms, and apocryphal traditions. They were invisible to those who looked only for literal meaning. But not to everyone. The Templars lived at a rare intersection. They were warriors, not theologians. But they were disciplined, literate, and exposed to a world of ideas far broader than most Europeans could imagine. They encountered Muslim scholars who preserved ancient texts, Jewish mystics who spoke in symbols and numbers, and ruins that whispered of civilizations far older than Rome. If fragments of Egyptian priestly knowledge survived anywhere beneath Jerusalem, they would not have appeared as scrolls labeled with explanations. They would have appeared as alignments, proportions, inscriptions without context. Dangerous not because they spoke, but because they invited understanding. The most dangerous idea Egypt ever produced was not a god, a spell, or a ritual. It was the idea that truth could be known, that the universe followed laws independent of belief, that human beings were capable of aligning themselves with those laws without permission. This was the knowledge that had to be guarded. This was the knowledge that later institutions feared. And this was the knowledge that, if rediscovered in the wrong era, could unravel the very foundations of power. If the Templars encountered even a shadow of this ancient worldview, they would have understood its implications immediately. Not as scholars, but as men sworn to obedience within a system that demanded submission. They would have known that such knowledge could not be preached, could only be carried, and carried in silence. The figure of Moses stands at the center of one of history's most influential narratives. Yet the closer one looks, the more unsettling questions begin to surface. He is remembered as the lawgiver, the prophet, the man who spoke directly with God. But before he was any of those things, Moses was something far more unusual and far more revealing. He was Egyptian. According to the biblical account itself, Moses was raised in the royal household of Pharaoh. This detail is often mentioned, then quickly passed over, as if it were a narrative convenience rather than a profound historical clue. But in ancient Egypt, royal education was not casual. To be raised in the palace was to be trained in administration, ritual, cosmology, mathematics, and sacred symbolism. Moses would not have grown up ignorant of Egyptian religion. He would have been immersed in it. This changes everything. Egyptian royal education did not merely prepare rulers to govern. It prepared them to embody cosmic order. Pharaoh was not just a king. He was a mediator between the human world and the divine structure of the universe. To fulfill this role, one had to understand Ma'at, the sacred balance that governed all existence. Law, justice, architecture, ritual, and even language were shaped by this principle. If Moses was trained in this environment, then his later actions cannot be understood as those of an uneducated shepherd suddenly receiving divine revelation. They reflect the behavior of someone translating one system of knowledge into another. The Exodus story itself bears striking similarities to Egyptian initiation narratives. A chosen individual passes through danger, exile, and transformation. He confronts authority, survives symbolic death, and returns bearing knowledge meant to reshape a people. Even the plagues, when viewed symbolically, correspond to disruptions of cosmic balance rather than random punishments. Each plague attacks an aspect of Egyptian order, suggesting a deeper understanding of how that order functioned. Then there is the moment at the burning bush. Moses encounters a divine presence that identifies itself not with a name, but with a statement of being, "I am that I am." This is not the language of a tribal deity demanding worship. It is abstract, philosophical, almost impersonal. It echoes Egyptian and earlier Near Eastern concepts of a foundational reality rather than a personalized god. This idea would later be reshaped into a more anthropomorphic deity, but its origin feels unmistakably older. When Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt, he does not offer them philosophy. He offers them law, commandments, external rules. This is often seen as divine authority imposed upon a people. But it may also represent a deliberate simplification of deeper principles that could not yet be safely taught. A nomadic population emerging from slavery was not prepared for initiatory knowledge. They needed structure, boundaries, and identity. What had once been an internal path of alignment with cosmic law became an external code of behavior. Ma'at became commandment. Balance became obedience. Yet traces of the older system remain embedded in the narrative. The Ark of the Covenant, for example, is described with extraordinary precision. Its dimensions, materials, rings, poles, and restrictions mirror Egyptian ritual objects used in temple ceremonies. It is not treated as a symbol alone, but as something dangerous to handle improperly. Unauthorized contact brings death. This power is not moral, it is structural. This is not how later religious relics behave. The tabernacle, too, is described as a mobile sacred space constructed according to exact instructions. Its layout follows a progression from outer court to inner sanctum, mirroring Egyptian temple design. Movement through space is controlled. Access is restricted. Only certain individuals may enter certain areas, and only after ritual preparation. This is initiation, not worship. Even the 10 Commandments themselves reflect an ethical framework that emphasizes balance, restraint, and order, values central to Egyptian moral philosophy. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not disrupt social harmony. These are not mystical proclamations. They are practical rules designed to maintain stability. What is striking is not that Moses rejected Egyptian ideas, but that he transformed them. The God he presents to the Israelites is jealous, singular, and authoritative. But beneath this personality lies something more abstract, a lawgiver whose rules govern reality itself. Disobedience brings consequence not because the God is offended, but because order is violated. This is a crucial distinction. Over time, the narrative hardens. The God becomes more human in emotion, more demanding of loyalty. The philosophical roots fade, replaced by theology. What was once a system of understanding becomes a matter of belief. But memory does not vanish completely. Certain passages in the Hebrew Bible hint at older ideas. God walking in the garden. God speaking from within fire and cloud. God refusing to show his face. These are not descriptions of a personal ruler, but of a presence that cannot be fully perceived. A force rather than a figure. This tension between abstract principle and personal deity runs throughout the text. It suggests a fusion of traditions rather than a single origin. When later generations encounter these stories, they inherit them without context. The Egyptian foundations are forgotten or deliberately suppressed. Egypt becomes the enemy, the land of bondage, the symbol of false gods. Its intellectual contributions are erased from the narrative. Yet the architecture, symbolism, and ritual language remain. By the time medieval Europe reads the story of Moses, it does so through layers of interpretation that obscure its origins. Moses is seen as a prophet of pure monotheism, standing in opposition to paganism. The possibility that he was transmitting a restructured form of Egyptian sacred science is never considered. But the Templars lived closer to the fault lines of this history. In the Near East, Jewish and Islamic traditions preserved alternative readings of Moses. In some mystical traditions, Moses is not merely a lawgiver but an initiate, someone who ascended through levels of understanding. Islamic accounts emphasize his encounters with hidden knowledge and mysterious teachers. Jewish mysticism hints at layers of meaning beneath the law. The Templars would have encountered these perspectives alongside physical remnants of older civilizations. They walked among ruins older than Rome, temples shaped by minds that understood geometry, light, and symbolism in ways medieval theology could not explain. If they re-examined the story of Moses through this lens, they may have seen him not as a breaker of Egyptian tradition, but as its final translator. This would have been a dangerous realization, because if the foundations of biblical law were rooted in a system of knowledge older than the Church, older than Israel itself, then religious authority was not absolute. It was inherited, adapted, conditional. Such an idea could not be preached without undermining everything medieval society depended on. And yet, it could not be unseen. The Templars were not philosophers, but they were disciplined observers. They valued structure, order, and obedience not as blind submission, but as tools for shaping behavior. Their internal rules mirrored monastic severity, but their worldview seems to have been shaped by something more austere and ancient. They followed a law, but they did not worship law itself. The story of Moses, when stripped of later dogma, reveals a man standing between worlds. Egyptian and Hebrew, knowledge and obedience, initiation and commandment. He did not destroy one system to create another. He adapted it for survival. If the Templars understood this, they would have recognized the pattern. Ancient knowledge does not vanish. It changes form. It hides within stories. It survives by becoming something else. Moses may not have been the first to carry Egyptian sacred science beyond the Nile, but he was the most influential. His legacy shaped religions, laws, and empires. Yet the deeper knowledge he carried was diluted, simplified, and eventually forgotten by those who inherited it. Forgotten by most, but perhaps not by those who knew how to look beneath the surface of history, and who understood that the most powerful truths are never announced openly. They are passed quietly, from one age to the next, waiting for minds capable of recognizing them again. For centuries, the Ark of the Covenant has been imagined as a sacred container. A gilded chest holding stone tablets, a symbol of divine presence carried through the wilderness. Artists painted it glowing with holy fire. Priests spoke of it as the throne of God on earth. Kings feared it, armies followed it, and entire theologies were built around it. But when the descriptions are read carefully, stripped of later reverence and examined through an older lens, the Ark begins to look far less like a symbolic object, and far more like something functional. The biblical text is unusually precise about the Arkansas. Its dimensions are exact. Its materials are specified without ambiguity. Acacia wood, overlaid inside and out with pure gold. A solid gold mercy seat. 2 cherubim formed of one piece with the lid, facing inward. Rings cast for poles. Poles never to be removed. No one permitted to touch it directly. This is not how myth is usually written. Myth thrives on metaphor, not measurements. But the Ark is described like an engineered object, constructed according to strict instructions and governed by rigid rules of interaction. Deviate from those rules and people die not because they offend God, but because they mishandle something dangerous. There are multiple accounts of this danger. When the Ark is touched improperly, death is immediate. When it is mishandled, it brings destruction even upon those who possess it. When it is opened, catastrophe follows. These consequences are never framed as moral judgment. They are mechanical. This distinction matters. In later religious thinking, divine punishment is often tied to sin or intention. But the Ark does not behave that way. It does not respond to belief, repentance, or prayer. It responds to proximity, contact, and protocol, like a force that obeys laws rather than emotions. Such behavior is not unique in ancient texts. In Egyptian ritual practice, sacred objects were treated not as symbols, but as active instruments. Certain devices were believed to channel divine energy, concentrate cosmic forces, or facilitate altered states of consciousness. They were constructed with specific materials chosen for their symbolic and energetic properties. Gold, for example, was not merely precious. It was associated with the eternal, the imperishable, the solar principle. Acacia wood, likewise, held symbolic and practical significance. It was durable, resistant to decay, and commonly used in ritual contexts. The combination of wood and gold appears repeatedly in Egyptian sacred objects, not for decoration, but for function. Even the requirement that the Ark be carried on poles echoes Egyptian processional equipment, designed to prevent direct contact with powerful ritual objects. Priests were trained to move these objects carefully, according to prescribed rites, because improper handling was believed to cause harm, not spiritual but real. When viewed in this context, the Ark begins to resemble a continuation rather than an invention. This placement, too, is telling. It resides in the innermost sanctum, the Holy of Holies, a space entered only once a year by a single individual under strict conditions. This mirrors Egyptian temple design, where the most sacred chamber was restricted to the highest initiate. Access was not denied out of jealousy, but out of necessity. The unprepared could not endure what occurred there. The Ark is said to be the place where God speaks. But how does this communication occur? There are no detailed descriptions of voices booming from the chest. Instead, there is an emphasis on presence, cloud, light, intensity. Moses enters, emerges transformed. His face shines. He must veil himself. These are not the reactions of someone who merely heard words. They are the reactions of someone exposed to something overwhelming, something transformative. This raises a possibility that unsettles traditional interpretations, that the Ark functioned as a focal point for altered states of consciousness, ritual experience, or sensory overload, designed to produce encounters interpreted as divine. Such experiences do not require deception. They require technology, ritual, and psychological preparation. Ancient cultures understood the human mind far better than modern arrogance often allows. They knew how sound, light, rhythm, isolation, and expectation could induce profound states of awareness. Egyptian initiation rites were built around these principles. Candidates were led through darkness and light, confined spaces and sudden revelation, silence followed by sound. The initiate did not learn through lecture, but through experience. Knowledge was felt before it was understood. If the Ark was a relic of this tradition, then it was never meant to be worshipped. It was meant to be used. This would explain why it is never depicted as an idol. No sacrifices are offered to it. No prayers addressed to it. It is not a god. It is an interface, a point of contact between human perception and something beyond ordinary experience. Over time, however, function becomes myth. As generations pass and original knowledge fades, objects outlive their instructions. Ritual becomes rote. Meaning is replaced by reverence. What was once a tool becomes a symbol, then a mystery, then a taboo. The Ark follows this trajectory. By the time it appears in later biblical narratives, its behavior is unpredictable. It brings victory, then disaster. It blesses, then curses. No one seems to fully understand it anymore, not even the priests charged with its care. This is the mark of lost knowledge, not divine caprice. Eventually, the Ark disappears. This fate is one of history's most enduring mysteries. Was it destroyed? Hidden? Carried away? Theories abound, but the absence itself may be the most important clue. Objects of true power are rarely left where they can be misused. They are buried, sealed, or dismantled, or their purpose is absorbed into architecture. The Temple of Solomon, built centuries later, may have been designed to replicate the Ark's function on a larger scale. Sacred geometry, controlled light, ritual sound, and spatial progression could achieve similar effects without reliance on a single object. The Holy of Holies becomes the Arkansas. The building itself becomes the instrument. If this is true, then the Ark was never lost. It was expanded. By the time the Templars arrived in Jerusalem, the Ark was already legend. But legends preserve memory, even when they distort it. The Templars would have encountered not the object, but the stories, and the architecture shaped by its legacy. They lived atop the Temple Mount. They moved through spaces designed with intention. They inhabited a site built to facilitate encounters that medieval theology no longer knew how to explain. If fragments of knowledge survived about what the Ark was meant to do, rather than what it symbolized, the Templars may have recognized them not as miracles but as mechanisms. This recognition would have been dangerous, because if divine encounters could be induced through design, ritual, and understanding, then they were no longer the exclusive domain of the Church. God would not be mediated solely through priesthood and sacrament, but accessed through knowledge. The Church could tolerate relics, could tolerate miracles, but it could not tolerate systems. Systems imply reproducibility, and reproducibility threatens control. The Ark, seen in this light, was not a relic of blind faith, but a remnant of an older tradition that treated spirituality as a science, dangerous, powerful, and tightly regulated. A tradition inherited, transformed, and partially forgotten by later religions. The Templars did not need to possess the Ark to be influenced by its legacy. They needed only to understand that such a thing had once existed, and that its disappearance was not an accident, but a safeguard. If they carried this understanding with them, it would explain much. Their reverence for sacred space, their emphasis on discipline and preparation, their silence regarding inner practices, their refusal to reduce faith to spectacle. They may have known that the most dangerous truths are not those that deny God, but those that redefine how humans encounter the divine. And that is a secret no medieval institution could allow to spread unchecked. So the Ark became a story, a legend, a mystery safely removed from practical understanding. But stories have a way of pointing back to realities long buried. And for those who know how to read them, the Ark still whispers, not of lost power, but of forgotten knowledge waiting patiently beneath the surface of history. Solomon's Temple has long been described as a house for God, a sacred dwelling built to honor the divine. Yet when its design is examined closely, it begins to resemble something far more deliberate than a place of worship. It appears engineered, calculated, constructed with an almost obsessive attention to proportion, alignment, and progression. This was not a building meant only to inspire awe. It was a structure meant to do something. The biblical descriptions of the temple are unusually technical. Lengths, widths, heights, materials, orientations, all are recorded with precision. Like the Ark, the temple is not left to interpretation. It follows a blueprint, and blueprints imply function. The temple was divided into 3 primary zones: the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. Movement between these spaces was strictly controlled. Each threshold marked a shift, not just in holiness but in experience. Light diminished, sound changed, access narrowed. The journey inward mirrored a psychological descent, drawing the participant away from the external world and toward a concentrated inner state. This is not accidental design. In Egyptian temples, this same principle governed sacred architecture. Initiates moved from public spaces into increasingly restricted chambers, culminating in a dark, enclosed sanctuary where the divine was encountered not through sight, but through sensation. Silence, darkness, and confinement were tools, not obstacles. They prepared the mind for altered perception. Solomon's Temple follows this logic. The Holy of Holies was a perfect cube, a shape rarely used without intention. In sacred geometry, the cube represents stability, completion, and containment. It is the three-dimensional expression of balance. To place the most sacred space within a cube was to declare that this chamber embodied cosmic order itself. Within this chamber stood the Arkansas. But if the Ark was not merely a symbol, then neither was the space that housed it. The temple, in this sense, functioned as an amplifier, a larger system designed to focus attention, ritual, and sensory input toward a singular experience. The building was not passive. It was participatory. Light played a crucial role. The temple's orientation allowed sunlight to enter in controlled ways, illuminating specific areas at specific times. Gold surfaces reflected and intensified this light, creating an atmosphere that would have felt alive, shifting, shimmering, overwhelming. Sound, too, was carefully managed. Chanting, instruments, and acoustics combined to produce resonance that could be felt in the body. These elements are not mystical speculation. They are architectural facts. Modern studies of ancient sacred sites have shown that many were constructed to produce psychological and physiological effects. Certain frequencies induce trance states. Enclosed spaces heighten sensory awareness. Repetition and rhythm alter perception of time. Ancient builders may not have used modern terminology, but they understood the effects. This knowledge did not originate in Israel. It was inherited. The temple's design reflects an understanding of sacred space that predates biblical religion. Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and even older traditions treated architecture as a medium through which divine order could be experienced directly. Temples were interfaces between human consciousness and cosmic structure. Over time, the purpose of these interfaces was forgotten or deliberately obscured. Ritual remained, but explanation vanished. What was once an experiential system became a theological monument. This forgetting may have been necessary. A society organized around rigid hierarchy and centralized authority cannot easily tolerate structures that facilitate direct encounters with the divine. Such encounters democratize spirituality. They undermine mediation. They create individuals who have experienced something beyond doctrine. Solomon's temple, if understood fully, would have been destabilizing. And so its deeper function faded into the background, overshadowed by its political and religious symbolism. The temple became the heart of national identity, the seat of priestly power, the focus of ritual sacrifice. Its architecture was revered, but not understood. Then it was destroyed. Its destruction is often framed as tragedy. But destruction can also be protection. A machine that no one understands but still functions is dangerous. Better to reduce it to rubble than allow accidental activation. When the Second Temple was built, much of the original context was already lost. Some dimensions changed. Certain features were simplified. The emphasis shifted further toward law and ritual. The building remained sacred, but its initiatory potency was diminished. Still, traces remained. By the time the Templars arrived in Jerusalem, the temple no longer stood, but its platform did. The Temple Mount preserved the orientation, the foundations, the subterranean spaces that once supported the structure. These foundations were ancient, massive, and shaped with an understanding of load, vibration, and alignment that suggests more than simple engineering. The Templars lived directly atop this foundation. They walked daily over a site designed to facilitate transformation. They prayed in spaces built to concentrate attention and suppress distraction. They occupied chambers that once controlled light, sound, and movement with surgical precision. Even without full understanding, such environments leave an impression. Human beings respond to space, to proportion, to enclosure and openness. The Temple Mount was not neutral ground. It was a place that shaped those who spent time upon it. If the Templars recognized this, even intuitively, they may have begun to view architecture differently. Their later buildings reflect a fascination with proportion, orientation, and symbolic geometry. Round churches, octagonal chapels, fortresses aligned with landscape features that served no obvious military purpose. These choices suggest a continuity of thought. The temple was not rebuilt by the Templars, but its logic traveled with them. They carried the idea that sacred experience could be structured, that space itself could guide the mind, that stone could teach. This idea would later reappear in Gothic cathedrals, where light, height, and proportion were used to evoke transcendence. But the Templars' approach was quieter, more restrained. They did not aim to overwhelm the senses, but to discipline them. The temple, in its original form, was not a spectacle. It was a system that assumed the divine was not distant, but immanent, accessible through alignment rather than petition. Such a system did not require constant interpretation. It required correct use. This distinction is critical. When religion becomes centered on belief, buildings become symbols. When spirituality is centered on experience, buildings become tools. The temple appears to belong to the latter category. Its destruction, therefore, was not merely an act of conquest. It was the dismantling of an interface whose purpose no longer fit the world that inherited it. The knowledge required to operate it safely had already begun to fade. But knowledge rarely disappears completely. Fragments persist in traditions, in symbols, in the instincts of those drawn to certain forms and spaces. The Templars may not have reconstructed the temple, but they absorbed its philosophy. That the divine could be approached through structure. That silence mattered. That access should be earned, not granted. These ideas would eventually place them at odds with institutions built on authority rather than understanding. The temple as a machine is not a denial of faith. It is a reminder that ancient spirituality was practical as well as symbolic. It sought to shape the human mind and align it with perceived cosmic order. Such an approach does not disappear easily. It waits, embedded in stone and story, until someone remembers how to see it, not as a monument to the past, but as a blueprint for a different way of encountering the sacred. And for those who recognize this, the temple ceases to be a ruin. It becomes a warning, There is no surviving document that plainly states what the Knights Templar discovered beneath Jerusalem. No inventory, no confession, no hidden manuscript that settles the question. Yet history rarely speaks directly about the things it fears most. Instead, it leaves traces, changes in behavior, sudden shifts in power, patterns that only become visible in hindsight. What matters is not a single object or revelation, but the moment after the Templars' long silence ended. Because when they emerged from Jerusalem as a recognized order, they were no longer the same men who had entered it. Before their years on the Temple Mount, the Templars were obscure and fragile. Afterward, they displayed a confidence that bordered on inevitability. They expanded with precision, not chaos. Their growth followed invisible lines, as if guided by an internal map rather than opportunity alone. This is the first clue. Power gained by accident is unstable. Power gained through understanding is disciplined. The Templars behaved like men who knew where they were going. Their rule became unusually strict, even by monastic standards. Obedience was absolute. Speech was controlled. Personal desire was suppressed. This was not merely religious severity, it was conditioning. The shaping of individuals to serve a purpose larger than themselves, and to protect something that could not be exposed carelessly. Orders that hoard wealth become indulgent. Orders that guard secrets become austere. The Templars chose austerity. At the same time, their external influence exploded. Donations poured in from across Europe. Kings entrusted them with treasuries. Nobles entrusted them with heirs. This level of trust is difficult to explain through reputation alone. Medieval Europe was deeply suspicious of power. Yet the Templars were treated as if they possessed an unseen legitimacy, an authority that did not need to be justified. People sensed something. Their fortresses, too, changed character. Early Templar strongholds were functional, but later ones reveal an obsession with placement and proportion. Some are built on high ground with no obvious strategic advantage. Others align with ancient roads, waterways, or celestial events. These choices make little sense if defense was the only concern. They make more sense if the Templars were applying a framework learned elsewhere. What they may have found in Jerusalem was not a relic that could be displayed, nor a doctrine that could be preached. It was a way of seeing the world, one that reframed religion, power, and human purpose. Fragments of ancient knowledge do not announce themselves as truth. They present as coherence, as patterns that suddenly make sense, as connections between architecture, ritual, and consciousness that feel obvious once perceived. This kind of discovery changes how a person moves through the world. The Templar symbolism begins to shift in subtle ways. Their seals depict ambiguous figures. Their language becomes layered. Their internal communication relies on signs and gestures rather than explicit explanation. This is how dangerous knowledge survives, by being recognizable only to those already prepared. The accusations later leveled against them offer another clue. They were charged with worshipping a strange head, with denying Christ in secret, with spitting on the cross during initiation. These accusations sound absurd at first glance, the product of torture and hysteria. But hysteria often distorts something real. Symbols can be misunderstood. If the Templars had adopted a more abstract concept of the divine, one rooted in structure rather than personhood, then traditional Christian symbols would lose their exclusive authority. Denial of Christ in this context would not mean rejection but redefinition. Christ as symbol rather than sole mediator. To medieval authorities, that distinction would be unacceptable. The so-called head they were accused of venerating may not have been an idol at all. In many ancient traditions, the head represents consciousness, awareness, the seat of perception. To revere the head is to revere knowledge itself. Such symbolism would be incomprehensible and terrifying to an institution built on obedience. The Templars were also accused of secrecy for secrecy's sake. But secrecy is not inherently malicious. It is protective. Initiatory traditions rely on silence not to exclude, but to prevent misuse. Knowledge given without preparation becomes destructive. If the Templars believed they had uncovered something that could destabilize faith, kingship, and social order, silence would have been a moral choice. This may explain why no sudden reform or new teaching followed their discovery. They did not seek to change the world directly. They sought to survive within it. Their financial system offers a telling parallel. Templar banking was not just innovative, it was trust-based. Trust requires predictability, structure, and confidence. These are the same qualities found in systems grounded in order rather than belief. The Templars treated the world as something that could be organized. This mindset aligns far more closely with ancient sacred science than with medieval mysticism. It reflects a belief that reality follows rules, and that those rules can be learned. Perhaps what they found beneath the Temple Mount was confirmation of this belief. Evidence that religion had once been inseparable from knowledge. That the divine was not chaos or whim, but structure. Such a realization would be both liberating and horrifying. Liberating because it restores agency to the human mind. Horrifying because it renders institutional authority provisional. The Templars may have seen themselves as custodians rather than reformers. They did not attempt to overthrow the church. They did not publish revelations. They operated quietly, building networks, protecting pilgrims, accumulating resources, not for indulgence but for stability. Stability buys time. Time allows knowledge to endure without exposure. This strategy worked for a while, but secrecy breeds suspicion. And suspicion, when combined with envy and debt, becomes lethal. Kings who owed the Templars money began to resent their autonomy. Clerics began to resent their exemption from local authority. The order's very restraint made them appear arrogant, aloof, unaccountable. They did not explain themselves, and explanation is often the price of survival. If the Templars had truly possessed nothing but orthodox faith and financial acumen, they might have compromised, paid off kings, opened their books, submitted to oversight. Instead, they held their silence, even when it led to destruction. This choice reveals more than any confession ever could. Men do not accept annihilation lightly. They accept it only when the alternative is worse. Perhaps the Templars believed that revealing what they knew would cause greater harm than their own deaths. Perhaps they understood that societies unprepared for certain truths respond not with enlightenment, but with violence. History supports this fear. Ideas that threaten identity are not debated. They are erased. The Templars may have concluded that their role was not to awaken the world, but to ensure that a fragment of ancient understanding survived somewhere, anywhere, until conditions were safer. What exactly that understanding was may never be fully reconstructed, but its outline is visible in the order's transformation. A shift from belief to structure, from spectacle to discipline, from proclamation to silence. They behaved like men who had seen behind the curtain and realized that pulling it back too far, too fast, would tear the stage apart. So they did what custodians have always done. They hid the truth not in vaults or relics, but in behavior, in architecture, in symbols that looked harmless to outsiders, in traditions that could be passed down without explanation. What the Templars found was not a thing that could be stolen. It was a way of seeing, and once seen it could never be unseen. That, more than gold or heresy, may have been the true reason they had to disappear. The Knights Templar left behind no theological treatises, no manifestos outlining their beliefs. What they left instead were images, quiet, persistent symbols that appear again and again in their seals, their architecture, and their material culture. To the casual observer, these symbols look Christian enough. A cross, a lamb, a sword. But when examined closely, something feels misaligned. As if these images are saying more than they should, or something other than what they appear to mean. One of the most striking aspects of Templar symbolism is how little it resembles the devotional art of its time. Medieval Christian imagery was explicit, emotional, and narrative. Christ suffering on the cross, saints in agony or ecstasy, heaven and hell rendered in dramatic contrast. The goal was clarity and obedience. See, believe, submit. Templar symbols do not behave this way. They are restrained, abstract, ambiguous. The red cross worn by the Templars, for example, is often treated as a simple emblem of martyrdom. yet its form varies in ways that are rarely discussed. It appears not only as the familiar Latin cross, but in equal-armed forms that more closely resemble ancient solar or balance symbols. Equal arms suggest symmetry, not sacrifice. Balance, not suffering. This distinction is subtle but profound. In ancient Egyptian symbolism, the ankh represented life, continuity, and the union of opposites. It was not a symbol of death redeemed, but of life sustained. When stripped of its loop top, the ankh becomes a cross, yet the meaning changes only if one forgets its origin. It is difficult to ignore how often the Templar cross appears closer to an equal-armed form than to the elongated crucifix favored by the Church. Another recurring image is the two knights sharing a single horse. Officially, this represents the order's early poverty. But poverty alone does not require repetition. Symbols endure because they carry layered meaning. Two figures, one mount. Duality contained within unity. Body and mind. Outer and inner. Action and understanding. This image echoes ancient symbolic language far more than medieval moral instruction. In Egyptian thought, duality was fundamental. Upper and Lower Egypt. Order and chaos. Visible and invisible. The task of the initiate was not to choose one over the other, but to reconcile them. Harmony was achieved not by dominance, but by balance. The Templar seal does not depict conquest or hierarchy. It depicts integration. Even more intriguing is the appearance of heads in later accusations and legends. The so-called Baphomet figure, often sensationalized in modern retellings, was described inconsistently by accusers, sometimes bearded, sometimes metallic, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent. These contradictions suggest not a literal idol, but a misunderstood symbol. In ancient traditions, the head is not merely a body part. It is the seat of awareness, the place where perception occurs. To revere the head is to revere consciousness itself. In Egyptian iconography, gods are often defined not by their bodies, but by what replaces or adorns their heads, animal forms representing qualities of perception. If the Templars employed a symbolic language that emphasized inner awareness over external authority, such imagery would be both natural to them and deeply threatening to their opponents. Christianity of the medieval period was built on the primacy of an external mediator. God was accessed through Christ, Christ through the Church through its hierarchy. Any symbol suggesting that understanding or awareness itself was sacred would undermine this chain. The cross, when viewed as a tool of balance rather than an instrument of execution, becomes something else entirely. It ceases to be a reminder of suffering and becomes a diagram of alignment. Vertical and horizontal, heaven and earth, spirit and matter. This is not speculation. Ancient cultures used crosses as cosmological symbols long before crucifixion existed. The Egyptians carved them. The Babylonians marked them. The symbol was universal because the idea was universal. The Templars did not invent these meanings. They inherited them. Their architecture reinforces this inheritance. Templar churches are often round or polygonal, defying the standard rectangular basilica form. The round shape emphasizes equality of distance from the center. No hierarchy, no privileged direction. Everyone stands equally before the core. This mirrors ancient temple designs where the central space represented the axis of the world, the point of contact between human and divine. Movement around this center was ritual, not congregational. Christian churches, by contrast, emphasize forward movement, toward the altar, toward authority. The Templars chose stillness. Even their burial practices differ. Templar graves are often unadorned. No elaborate effigies. No dramatic inscriptions. Death is treated not as a spectacle, but as a transition. This restraint aligns more closely with initiatory traditions than with medieval Christian obsession with judgment and afterlife imagery. When these elements are viewed together, a pattern emerges. The Templar symbolic language consistently de-emphasizes external drama and emphasizes internal order. Balance over emotion. Structure over narrative. Silence over proclamation. This is not accidental. Symbols are chosen carefully when words are dangerous. If the Templars had indeed encountered remnants of ancient sacred science, ideas suggesting that the divine was structural rather than personal, it would explain their symbolic choices perfectly. They would need a language that could carry meaning without attracting attention. One that could be dismissed as orthodox by those who did not look closely. The Church tolerated symbols so long as they reinforced obedience. It became alarmed only when symbols began to suggest autonomy. A cross that represents suffering reinforces dependence. A cross that represents balance invites understanding. The line between the two is thin, but institutions collapse along such lines. This may also explain why accusations against the Templars focused so heavily on symbolism rather than doctrine. They were not accused of preaching a rival theology. They were accused of strange gestures, secret signs, ambiguous images. The Church sensed deviation, but could not articulate it. Symbols threaten power precisely because they bypass argument. They speak directly to intuition. When King Philip moved against the Templars, he did not attack them as philosophers. He attacked them as heretics engaged in secret rites. This framing allowed him to mobilize fear rather than debate. Symbols that could not be explained were labeled demonic. Ambiguity became guilt. The irony is that symbols only become dangerous when their original meaning has been forgotten. To the Egyptian priest, the ankh was not controversial. To the medieval inquisitor, any unfamiliar symbol suggested corruption. The same image, seen through different levels of understanding, produces opposite reactions. The Templars existed between these worlds. They lived in a time when older symbolic languages still lingered in the East, while the West hardened into doctrinal certainty. They absorbed meanings that no longer had a place in official Christianity. So they embedded those meanings quietly, in places where only the prepared would notice. A cross that balances instead of bleeds. A temple that centers instead of commands. A seal that unites instead of conquers. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of preservation. The Templars did not replace the cross with the ankh. They allowed the ankh to survive within the cross, invisible to those who saw only suffering and salvation. This is how ancient knowledge persists, not by overthrowing new religions, but by nesting within them. When the order was destroyed, its symbols did not vanish. They scattered into guilds, into architecture, into traditions that no longer remembered where they came from. And that may have been the point. Because a symbol understood by too many becomes a doctrine. A symbol understood by few remains a key. The Templars may have known that their greatest defense was ambiguity. That as long as their symbols could be explained away as harmless, the deeper meaning would survive. Until someone, centuries later, began to notice that the cross they carried did not behave quite like the one preached from the pulpit. That it pointed not only upward but inward. And that it quietly asked a question medieval Christianity was never meant to answer. What if the divine is not something you obey, but something you align with? The speed and scale of the Knights Templars' wealth has long puzzled historians, but what makes it truly unsettling is not how much they acquired. It is how little sense their fortune makes when measured against the world they lived in. Medieval Europe was not a place where wealth appeared quickly. Power accumulated slowly through land, bloodlines, and royal favor. Even kings struggled to raise money, constantly borrowing, taxing, and warring to sustain their courts. Yet within a few decades, an order that had begun in poverty possessed resources that rivaled entire kingdoms. And they did so without behaving like conquerors. The Templars did not seize territory for profit. They did not trade goods at scale. They did not demand tribute in the way feudal lords did. Their income streams on paper appear modest: donations, estates, rents. None of these explain the confidence with which they lent money to monarchs, financed crusades, and absorbed losses that would have bankrupted other institutions. Something about their economy defied normal logic. The most common explanation is banking innovation. The Templars are often credited with creating early forms of letters of credit, allowing pilgrims to deposit funds in one location and withdraw them elsewhere. This was revolutionary, yes, but innovation alone does not generate trust on the scale the Templars enjoyed. Trust is not granted to systems. It is granted to people who appear to know what they are doing. Kings did not simply use Templar banking services. They relied on them. They placed national treasuries in Templar custody. They entrusted them with ransoms, taxes, and emergency funds. These were not cautious men. They were paranoid, ambitious rulers accustomed to betrayal. Yet they trusted the Templars implicitly. Why? Part of the answer lies in discipline. The order's internal rules were brutally strict. Personal wealth was forbidden. Corruption was punished severely. The Templars presented themselves as incorruptible by design. A man who owned nothing personally could not be bribed easily. But incorruptibility alone does not explain omnipresence. The Templars seemed to anticipate need. Their commanderies were positioned with uncanny foresight. They controlled routes before those routes became essential. They established strongholds in places that later proved decisive. It was as if they understood flows of people, of money, of conflict before others did. This suggests planning on a level uncommon for the era. Planning requires models. Models require knowledge. If the Templars had absorbed a worldview that emphasized structure, balance, and systemic thinking, rather than opportunism, they would naturally approach wealth differently. Not as something to be hoarded, but as something to be circulated, stabilized, directed. Their banking system reflects this philosophy. It was not speculative. It was conservative. Funds were safeguarded, not gambled. Records were meticulous. Losses were absorbed quietly, without panic. The order behaved less like a medieval guild and more like a modern institution. This anachronism is telling. Modern financial systems emerged alongside scientific thinking, understanding that complex systems obey underlying rules. Medieval Europe, by contrast, treated wealth as a function of divine favor, inheritance, or force. The Templars treated it as something that could be managed rationally. This approach mirrors ancient economic thought more than medieval practice. In Egypt, wealth was not measured solely by accumulation, but by stability. Grain reserves, controlled distribution, long-term planning. The Nile cycles demanded foresight, not impulse. Those who understood the system prospered not by excess, but by balance. If the Templars inherited even a fragment of this mindset, it would explain their financial behavior. They were not seeking riches. They were seeking resilience. This may also explain why their wealth provoked such hostility. Kings who borrow become resentful. Credit undermines the illusion of sovereignty. A ruler who owes money is no longer absolute. The Templars' financial independence placed them outside the feudal hierarchy. They could fund wars without fighting them, influence outcomes without issuing commands. This kind of power is invisible and therefore terrifying. King Philip IV of France did not attack the Templars because they were poor stewards of money. He attacked them because they were too effective. He owed them enormous sums. More importantly, he could not control them. Debt alone does not cause annihilation. Dependency does. The Church, too, grew uneasy. Financial power meant leverage. The Templars answered only to the Pope, yet their resources rivaled papal authority. They funded crusades, protected pilgrims, and maintained military forces independently. They did not need permission to act. Institutions built on hierarchy do not tolerate autonomous systems. What makes the Templars' wealth even more suspicious is how little of it survived their fall. When the order was dismantled, much of its treasure simply vanished. Some was seized, yes, but not nearly enough to account for centuries of accumulation. Commanderies were searched, accounts examined. Still, the numbers did not add up. This disappearance has fueled endless speculation about hidden treasure. But physical gold is the least interesting possibility. The true wealth of the Templars may not have been stored in vaults. It may have been embedded in systems, knowledge of logistics, networks of trust, methods of organization, ways of thinking about resources that could not be confiscated by force. When the order fell, these intangible assets dispersed quietly, absorbed by other institutions. This would explain why later organizations, guilds, banking families, even early Masonic lodges, seemed to inherit Templar efficiency without inheriting their name. Wealth, when understood structurally, does not vanish. It migrates. The Templars' refusal to display opulence also deserves attention. Unlike other wealthy orders or nobles, they did not indulge in extravagant courts or monuments. Their buildings were solid, not lavish. Their attire remained simple. Their public image emphasized restraint. This restraint was strategic. Display attracts attention. Attention invites scrutiny. Scrutiny leads to exposure. If the Templars were guarding something more valuable than money, something that required secrecy, they would naturally avoid drawing unnecessary focus to their material success. Their wealth was a tool, not a statement, and tools are meant to be used quietly. The accusations against them later included charges of greed. But these accusations ring hollow when compared to the behavior of truly corrupt institutions of the era. The Templars did not live like men obsessed with riches. They lived like men who understood the temporary nature of material wealth. This understanding aligns with ancient initiatory traditions, which taught that matter was a means, not an end. Stability mattered. Excess did not. If the Templars had indeed absorbed such a philosophy, it would explain why their wealth made no sense to their contemporaries. Medieval Europe expected money to behave emotionally, rewarding loyalty, punishing enemies, reinforcing status. The Templars treated it impersonally. Money flowed through them, not to them. This impersonality was deeply unsettling. It suggested a worldview in which power did not need to announce itself, where influence could be exerted without spectacle, where control was achieved through understanding rather than domination. Such a worldview is dangerous to kings. When Philip IV moved against the Templars, he framed the attack as moral and religious. But beneath the accusations lay a simpler truth. The Templars had outgrown the system meant to contain them. Their wealth was not the cause of their destruction. It was the symptom. The cause was that they had learned how to operate within the world without being bound by its usual limitations. They understood systems, financial, logistical, perhaps even spiritual, in ways that made them unpredictable. And unpredictability is intolerable to those who rule by fear and tradition. In the end, the Templars' wealth did not save them, but it revealed something far more important, that they were playing a different game entirely. One in which gold was not the ultimate prize. One in which knowledge, applied quietly, patiently, and with discipline, was worth far more than any treasure a king could seize. And that is the kind of wealth that truly makes no sense until it is too late. When the accusations against the Knights Templar were finally read aloud, even those who feared the order sensed something was wrong. The charges were shocking, yes, but more than that, they were strange, disjointed, inconsistent. They did not sound like the discovery of a single, coherent heresy. They sounded like fragments of something half understood, filtered through fear, pain, and political necessity. The Templars were accused of denying Christ, of spitting on the cross, of worshipping idols, of engaging in secret rituals that mocked Christian sacraments, of kissing one another in obscene ways, of venerating a mysterious head that could speak, prophesy, or bestow wealth. To the medieval ear, these claims were enough to condemn any group outright. Yet when examined closely, the accusations collapse into contradiction. Some Templars confessed to one set of practices. Others denied them entirely. Descriptions of the supposed idol varied wildly. No two accounts matched in detail. This inconsistency is often explained by torture, and torture certainly played its role. But torture alone does not explain why these particular accusations emerged, nor why they followed certain symbolic patterns rather than random blasphemy. Pain can force words from a person's mouth, but it cannot invent a symbolic language from nothing. The accusations reflect misunderstanding, not fabrication. Take the charge of spitting on the cross. This act, if taken literally, would be an obvious rejection of Christ. But in initiatory traditions, symbolic rejection is often used to strip an initiate of inherited assumptions. To deny the outer form is not to deny the principle, it is to move beyond surface meaning. In ancient mystery schools, initiates were sometimes required to symbolically reject familiar gods or rituals as part of a psychological break from unexamined belief. This was not apostasy, it was transition. To a medieval inquisitor, such nuance would be invisible. The cross itself had become inseparable from suffering and obedience. To treat it symbolically rather than devotionally was unthinkable. Any deviation from reverence could only be interpreted as hatred. Yet if the Templars viewed the cross not as an object of worship but as a diagram, a symbol of balance, alignment, or cosmic structure, then ritual gestures involving it would carry meanings that the Church could not recognize. What looked like desecration may have been recontextualization. The accusation of idol worship follows a similar pattern. The so-called Baphomet has become infamous in modern retellings, but medieval descriptions are vague to the point of absurdity. Sometimes it is a head with a beard. Sometimes it has 3 faces. Sometimes it is metallic. Sometimes it speaks. Sometimes it does nothing at all. No physical idol was ever produced. This matters. If the Templars truly worshipped a forbidden god, evidence would have existed. Objects leave traces. Ritual paraphernalia survives. Yet nothing concrete was ever found, only testimonies extracted under duress. The head may not have been an idol at all, but a symbol misunderstood by interrogators. As in many ancient traditions, the head represents consciousness, intellect, the locus of awareness. To venerate the head is to venerate understanding. Such symbolism would be completely alien to a church that emphasized submission over insight. The accusation that the head granted wealth is particularly revealing. Knowledge that allows one to navigate systems effectively appears magical to those who do not understand it. Predictability looks like prophecy. Planning looks like sorcery. If the Templars possessed methods of organization, finance, or discipline that produced consistent success, their enemies would naturally attribute that success to supernatural favor or forbidden forces. This is how envy transforms into accusation. The charges of obscene rituals also deserve careful examination. Medieval inquisitors often framed unfamiliar initiation practices as sexual deviance. Secret gestures, kisses exchanged during ceremonies, physical contact, all could be reinterpreted as perversion when stripped of context. Initiatory rituals frequently use controlled physical acts to break down social barriers and create bonds of trust. These acts are symbolic, not erotic. But to outsiders, especially those intent on condemnation, symbolism collapses into scandal. What emerges from the accusations is not a picture of moral decay, but of cultural collision. The Templars appear to have practiced rites that did not conform to standard Christian liturgy. They valued secrecy. They employed symbolism that was not explained openly. They treated familiar icons in unfamiliar ways. To the Church, this was intolerable. Not because it was evil, but because it was unclassifiable. Heresy can be debated. Corruption can be punished. But ambiguity threatens authority itself. If people begin to suspect that there are layers of meaning beyond official doctrine, they may start asking questions. Questions lead to interpretation. Interpretation leads to autonomy. The Church had spent centuries eliminating competing symbolic systems. Pagan rituals were absorbed, rebranded, or destroyed. Mystery traditions were suppressed or forced underground. Christianity became not just a faith but an epistemology, a way of determining what could be known and how. The Templars disrupted this certainty. They did not challenge doctrine publicly, but their internal practices suggested that doctrine was not the final word. They treated symbols as tools rather than objects of worship. They emphasized discipline and preparation over belief. These traits align more closely with initiatory traditions than with medieval Christianity. The Inquisitors sensed this, even if they could not articulate it. Their accusations circle around the same themes: secrecy, symbols, alternative interpretations of sacred objects. The fear was not that the Templars had replaced Christ with another god, but that they had moved beyond the need for mediation. This fear intensified under torture, where confusion and pain blurred memory and meaning. A symbolic gesture became a literal act. A metaphor became an idol. A philosophical concept became a demon. The result was a narrative grotesque enough to justify annihilation. King Philip did not need the accusations to be coherent. He needed them to be convincing enough. Fear does not demand consistency. It demands spectacle. The Church, pressured and compromised, went along. What is often overlooked is how the Templars responded. They did not mount a theological defense. They did not explain their symbols. They did not clarify their rituals. Even when faced with death, many remained silent or offered vague denials. This silence is telling. If the accusations were entirely false, one would expect outrage. If they were entirely true, one would expect defiance. Instead, there was restraint. The Templars behaved like men who knew that explanation would only make things worse. Symbols explained to the uninitiated lose their power and often become dangerous. Ancient traditions understood this well. Knowledge revealed without preparation destabilizes both the knower and the society around them. The Templars may have believed that their internal practices could not be defended without exposing deeper ideas that the world was not ready to confront. So they allowed the narrative to stand. History remembers this as weakness or guilt. But there is another possibility, that it was a final act of custodianship. By accepting condemnation, the Templars ensured that whatever they carried would not be dissected, debated, or corrupted. Their silence sealed the knowledge more effectively than any vault. The accusations, when stripped of hysteria, point not to moral corruption but to philosophical divergence. The Church accused the Templars of crimes it could not name properly because it did not fully understand them. What was being tried was not heresy in the conventional sense. It was a way of knowing. And ways of knowing, once threatened, are rarely debated on equal terms. They are silenced. The tragedy of the Templars is not that they were falsely accused. It is that they were accused accurately, but interpreted through a lens incapable of understanding what it was seeing. The truth was not that the Templars rejected Christianity. It was that they no longer needed it to mediate what they believed to be real. And that realization, more than any ritual or symbol, was the most unforgivable crime of all. At the heart of the conflict between the Knights Templar and the institutions that destroyed them lies a concept so subtle that it is almost invisible to modern readers, a concept not defined by ritual, symbol, or law, but by absence. An absence of form, an absence of name. In Egyptian theology, the highest principle was not a god with a face, a voice, or a personality. It was something far more elusive. Before the pantheon, before myth, before image, there existed a source that could not be depicted because it could not be limited. The Egyptians understood that anything named becomes bounded, and anything bounded becomes incomplete. This ultimate principle was not worshipped in the way later religions worshipped their gods. It was acknowledged. It was the silent structure beneath reality. The gods of Egypt, Ra, Osiris, Isis, Thoth, were not creators in the absolute sense. They were expressions, functions, manifestations of deeper cosmic laws. They governed aspects of existence, but they were not existence itself. Even they operated within Ma'at, the order that preceded and constrained them. This idea is profoundly destabilizing to hierarchical religion. Because if the highest reality cannot be named, cannot be personified, and cannot be commanded, then no institution can claim exclusive access to it. Authority becomes provisional. Power becomes conditional. Knowledge replaces obedience. When later traditions inherited fragments of this worldview, they struggled to contain it. The Hebrew Bible offers one of the clearest examples. When Moses asks the divine presence at the burning bush for its name, the response is not a name at all. I am that I am. A statement of being, not identity. Philosophical, abstract, resistant to image. This moment is often treated as poetic mystery, but in its original context it is radical. A god without a name cannot be invoked like other gods, cannot be localized, cannot be represented by statue or symbol. Such a god is not an object of worship so much as a condition of existence. Over time, this abstraction was softened. The nameless became Yahweh. The impersonal became personal. The unknowable became a ruler who issued commands and demanded loyalty. This transformation was necessary for social cohesion, but it came at a cost. The cost was philosophical depth. What had once been an encounter with being itself became a relationship with authority. Law replaced alignment. Faith replaced understanding. Christianity inherited this tension and intensified it. God became not only personal, but incarnate. Divinity was no longer a structure of reality. It walked, spoke, suffered, and died. This made God accessible, relatable, and emotionally powerful. It also made God controllable. If divinity could be defined through doctrine, then institutions could regulate access to it. Salvation became mediated. Knowledge became secondary to belief. Mystery became something to be accepted, not explored. The Egyptian concept of an unnamed source had no place in this system, yet it never fully disappeared. It survived in negative theology, the idea that God can only be described by what he is not. It survived in mysticism, where direct experience was valued over doctrine. It survived in symbols that pointed inward rather than upward. And it may have survived in the Templars. The accusations against the order repeatedly hint at something strange. That the Templars did not worship God as others did. That their rituals lacked the expected reverence. That their understanding of divinity felt distant, abstract, impersonal. To medieval authorities, this was indistinguishable from atheism. But atheism, as understood today, did not exist in that world. Denial of God was not the issue. Redefinition was. If the Templars had absorbed a worldview in which the divine was not a being to be appeased, but a principle to be aligned with, their spirituality would have appeared cold, even blasphemous. Prayer would become discipline. Ritual would become preparation. Obedience would become training rather than submission. This shift is subtle but devastating to religious authority. Because a God without a name cannot be monopolized. Such a God cannot be used to legitimize kings, bless wars, or enforce obedience through fear of punishment. It offers no divine favoritism. It rewards understanding, not loyalty. This is why the idea is so dangerous. Egyptian priests understood this danger intimately. That is why the highest knowledge was never spoken publicly. It was revealed only to those who had demonstrated discipline, restraint, and moral balance. Knowledge without preparation was chaos. The Templars, operating within a rigid Christian framework, would have recognized the same risk. To speak openly of a nameless, impersonal divine source would not liberate people. It would shatter their world. Better to encode it. Better to hide it behind symbols that could be interpreted in orthodox ways by those who needed certainty, and in deeper ways by those who were ready. This may explain why the Templar symbols are so restrained. Why their rituals were silent. Why their theology, if it existed, was never written down. Words give shape. Shape invites control. Silence preserves openness. The Church, however, could not tolerate openness. A God without a name undermines confession, undermines prayer as petition, undermines the entire economy of sin and redemption. If the divine is not offended, then guilt loses its leverage. If alignment matters more than belief, then authority shifts inward. Such ideas would dissolve the medieval worldview from the inside. When inquisitors accused the Templars of denying Christ, they may have sensed this shift without understanding it. Christ, in Christian theology, is the mediator, the bridge between humanity and God. To render mediation unnecessary is to deny Christ's function, even if one honors his symbolism. From the Church's perspective, this was unforgivable. Yet from the perspective of ancient sacred science, it was inevitable. Mystery traditions do not destroy religions. They outgrow them. They see doctrines as stages, not destinations. Tools for shaping societies, not ultimate truths. When those tools outlive their usefulness, the deeper principles remain, quiet, waiting. The Templars may have stood at this threshold. Still Christian in form, but no longer dependent on Christian mediation. Loyal in appearance, but internally oriented toward a more abstract understanding of reality. This would explain their calm in the face of destruction. Men who believe their souls depend on institutional salvation fight desperately to preserve that institution. Men who believe alignment matters more than belief can accept death without panic. The executions of Templars do not read like the deaths of fanatics or heretics. They read like the deaths of initiates, silent, composed, unwilling to perform repentance for a system they no longer required. Jacques de Molay's final declaration of innocence was not a theological defense. It was a moral one. He did not argue doctrine. He asserted truth. This distinction matters. Truth, in the ancient sense, is not correctness of belief. It is alignment with reality. Ma'at, not law. Balance, not obedience. A God without a name cannot be offended by incorrect theology. Only by imbalance. If the Templars carried even a fragment of this understanding, they would have known that their fate was already decided, not by God, but by institutions threatened by irrelevance. The Church did not destroy the Templars because they worshipped the wrong God. It destroyed them because they no longer needed one that could be named. And that idea, quiet, abstract, and devastating, may be the most dangerous inheritance the ancient world ever passed down. The morning of Friday, October 13, 1307, did not arrive with thunder or omens. It arrived quietly, almost politely, as if history itself were holding its breath. By the time most of France awoke, the fate of the Knights Templar had already been sealed. The orders had been prepared weeks in advance, written in careful legal language and sealed with royal authority. They were delivered across the kingdom under strict instructions. Do not open until the appointed hour. This secrecy was not ceremonial. It was tactical. King Philip IV knew that if even a single Templar commandery were warned, the orders network would react instantly. Messages would move faster than soldiers. Assets would vanish. Men would disappear. So Philip chose surprise. At dawn, royal officers arrived simultaneously at Templar houses across France. There were no negotiations, no warnings, no chance to appeal to the Church. Brothers were seized where they stood, at prayer, at breakfast, in their beds. Records were confiscated. Seals broken. Property claimed in the king's name. This was not an arrest. It was a decapitation. Philip justified the action as a moral necessity. He accused the Templars of heresy, corruption, and secret blasphemies that threatened Christendom itself. But beneath the language of righteousness lay something far more personal. Desperation. Philip was drowning in debt. Years of war, extravagant court life, and political ambition had drained the royal treasury. He had already debased the currency, expelled Jewish communities to seize their assets, and clashed repeatedly with the papacy over money and authority. Each measure bought him time, but at a cost. His legitimacy was eroding, and still he owed the Templars enormous sums. The order was not merely a creditor. It was the financial infrastructure that made Philip's rule possible. To be indebted to them was to be dependent. To be dependent was to be vulnerable. Philip could not force the Templars to forgive the debt. He could not seize their assets without justification. And he could not tolerate an institution that operated beyond his control, answering to no crown and wielding influence that rivaled his own. So he did what threatened rulers have always done. He reframed necessity as virtue. The accusations against the Templars were not discovered through investigation. They were assembled, whispered by informants whose motivations were questionable, amplified by officials who understood what the king required, presented not as allegations to be tested, but as truths to be enforced. The Pope, Clement V, was caught in the middle. Clement was no crusading zealot. He was cautious, politically entangled, and deeply aware of Philip's power. The papacy itself was vulnerable, having recently been pressured into relocating from Rome to Avignon, firmly under French influence. When Philip moved against the Templars, Clement hesitated. He called for inquiry, for evidence, for restraint. But hesitation is not resistance. And Philip knew how to exploit that. The arrests had already happened. The narrative was already public. Confessions, extracted under torture, were already circulating. To defend the Templars now would be to defend alleged heretics, and to challenge the authority of the French crown. Clement compromised. He allowed the investigations to proceed. He sanctioned inquiries that he could not fully control. He attempted to preserve the appearance of papal authority while conceding ground with every step. This slow capitulation would haunt the Church for centuries. The trials that followed were not trials in any modern sense. Torture was routine. Confessions were expected. Retractions were punished. Truth became whatever survived the pain. Many Templars confessed to anything that would make the suffering stop. Others refused and died under interrogation. A few recanted publicly when given the chance, only to be executed as relapsed heretics. Throughout it all, the order as a whole remained eerily silent. There was no coordinated defense, no uprising, no attempt to leverage their immense resources to fight back. This absence of resistance has often been interpreted as guilt or incompetence. But there is another possibility. The Templars may have known that resistance would only confirm the narrative being constructed around them. A violent response would turn them into enemies of Christendom overnight. An organized escape would be framed as proof of conspiracy. Silence, though fatal, preserved ambiguity. Philip, meanwhile, moved with ruthless efficiency. He seized Templar properties. He redirected funds. He presented himself as a defender of the faith, cleansing the realm of corruption. Public opinion, fueled by rumor and fear, largely accepted the story. Heresy is easier to believe when it benefits those in power. What is often overlooked is how narrow Philip's victory truly was. He did not destroy the Templars' ideas. He destroyed their legal existence. He dismantled their visible structure. But much of what made the order powerful, its methods, its networks, its knowledge, did not reside in buildings or treasuries. It resided in people. Some Templars vanished before they could be arrested. Others were absorbed into different orders. Some fled to regions beyond Philip's reach. Their identities changed, but their experience did not. Philip's fear was not unfounded. An institution that understands systems, financial, logistical, symbolic, cannot be erased simply by decree. It dissolves, adapts, and reappears elsewhere. The Friday arrests were meant to end a problem. Instead, they transformed it. By attacking the Templars, Philip legitimized the very fears that had driven him. He acknowledged, publicly and irrevocably, that the order represented a threat greater than military force. He revealed that control of narrative, finance, and knowledge mattered more than swords. This revelation did not go unnoticed. Other rulers took note. So did emerging institutions. The lesson was clear. Power no longer resided solely in land or bloodlines. It resided in systems and those who understood them. The Templars had been among the first to grasp this truth in medieval Europe. Their destruction was not a return to order. It was a sign that order itself was changing. When Jacques de Molay was finally executed in 1314, burned alive on an island in the Seine, he did not confess to heresy. He did not beg forgiveness. He declared the order innocent and called upon God to judge those who had condemned it unjustly. Within a year, both Philip IV and Pope Clement V were dead. Medieval chroniclers saw this as divine retribution. Curse, a moral lesson. But history does not require curses to explain consequence. Philip achieved his immediate goals. He erased his debts. He consolidated power. He silenced an institution that challenged his authority. But he also accelerated the decline of moral legitimacy in monarchy and church alike. The trials exposed the fragility of truth under power. They demonstrated that righteousness could be manufactured, and that innocence offered no protection. This lesson would echo through the centuries. The Friday the world changed was not defined by the fall of the Templars alone. It marked a shift in how power justified itself. From divine right to legal maneuver, from faith to fear, from open authority to managed perception. The Templars were not destroyed because they were weak. They were destroyed because they represented a future that arrived too early, one in which knowledge, not lineage, determined influence. Philip's strike was precise, ruthless, and effective. It was also an admission that whatever the Templars carried, whether ancient knowledge, systemic understanding, or a different way of seeing the world, was dangerous enough to warrant annihilation. And that danger did not die with them. It simply went underground. When the Knights Templar were destroyed, their enemies believed they were erasing an order. What they did not realize was that the order had already begun writing itself into stone. Across Europe, Long before the arrests and trials, massive buildings were rising from the earth. Structures so ambitious, so mathematically precise, that even modern engineers still debate how they were accomplished. Gothic cathedrals pierced the sky with impossible height. Stone seemed to dissolve into light. Arches balanced forces with elegance that defied the brute logic of medieval construction. These were not merely churches. They were statements. Officially, the cathedrals were built for God, funded by bishops and kings, dedicated to saints and relics. But behind the public narrative lay a quieter truth. Many of the techniques, proportions, and symbolic frameworks used in these buildings did not originate with the church. They appeared suddenly, too suddenly. Romanesque architecture had been heavy, grounded, fortress-like. Then, within a few generations, builders began working with ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, pointed arches, and luminous interiors that transformed stone into something almost immaterial. This was not gradual evolution. It was transmission. Knowledge had moved. The question is not whether the Templars built the Gothic cathedrals directly. In most cases, they did not. The question is why so many of the ideas embedded in these structures mirror principles long associated with ancient sacred science, and why the sudden flowering of this architecture coincides precisely with the rise and fall of the Templars. Gothic cathedrals are governed by geometry, not decoration. Their proportions follow harmonic ratios. Their layouts encode symbolic journeys. Movement through the space is choreographed, guiding the visitor from darkness to light, from compression to expansion. The building teaches without speaking. This approach is older than Christianity. Egyptian temples were designed the same way, not as places for congregations, but as instruments for shaping perception. The initiate moved through controlled space, encountering changes in light, sound, and scale that induced awe, humility, and altered awareness. Gothic cathedrals replicate this effect almost exactly. The vertical emphasis draws the eye upward, but the geometry anchors the experience inward. Light floods the interior through stained glass, transforming narrative imagery into pure color and vibration. Stone disappears. Boundaries soften. The visitor feels small but also connected. This is not accidental. Such experiences do not arise from faith alone. They arise from understanding how human beings respond to space. Medieval theology could explain why one should feel awe before God. It could not explain how to engineer that feeling consistently. Yet Gothic builders achieved it repeatedly, across regions, with remarkable precision. Someone understood the system. The guilds that built these cathedrals were secretive. Knowledge was transmitted orally, through apprenticeship. Master builders did not publish manuals. Techniques were guarded. Symbols were used instead of explanations. Geometry replaced text. This is how initiatory knowledge survives. Many of these guilds operated independently of local bishops. Some traveled widely, working on projects far from their home regions. Their symbols, tools, marks, coded diagrams bear striking resemblance to symbolic languages later preserved in Freemasonry. This continuity is not coincidental. When the Templars were dismantled, their visible wealth and military presence vanished. But their ideas about structure, discipline, symbolic transmission were already embedded in other systems. Architecture was one of them. Stone does not confess under torture. Stone does not forget. The cathedrals that rose in the centuries following the Templars' fall were not memorials to the order. They were something more subtle, vessels. Places where ideas could be experienced without being explained. Where ancient principles could survive disguised as devotion. To the average worshipper, a cathedral was a house of God. To those who knew how to read it, it was a book written in proportion and light. Consider the emphasis on the square and the circle, forms that appear repeatedly in cathedral layouts. The square represents stability, earth, structure. The circle represents eternity, unity, the infinite. Their intersection symbolizes the meeting of heaven and earth, spirit and matter. This symbolism predates Christianity by millennia. In Egyptian sacred geometry, these forms were not metaphors. They were expressions of cosmic order. To build with them was to participate in that order. The Church tolerated this symbolism because it could be interpreted theologically. But theology was not its original language. Another recurring feature is alignment. Many cathedrals are oriented toward specific solar events, equinoxes, solstices, feast days tied to light. Sunlight enters through particular windows at particular times, illuminating altars or symbolic points with astonishing precision. This is astronomy, not piety. Egyptian temples were famously aligned with stars and solar cycles. These alignments were not decorative. They connected ritual time with cosmic time, reminding initiates that human action was embedded in a larger rhythm. To embed such alignments in Christian cathedrals was to preserve a worldview that saw the universe as ordered and intelligible. Again, this idea is dangerous. An ordered universe invites understanding. Understanding invites autonomy. Autonomy weakens control. The Church permitted these structures because it no longer fully understood what they encoded. The builders spoke in stone, not sermons. Their language was invisible to those who listened only for words. The Templars may not have designed the cathedrals themselves, but they lived at the moment when this transmission became possible. They had contact with Eastern knowledge. They understood sacred geometry. They valued silence, discipline, and symbolic instruction. When their order was destroyed, they did not take this knowledge with them into oblivion. They allowed it to flow into systems that could survive. Architecture was ideal. A building cannot be accused of heresy, cannot deny Christ, cannot be tortured into confession. It simply stands, quiet, patient, shaping those who enter it. Over time, the Church embraced these cathedrals as expressions of its own glory. Their origins were forgotten, their symbolic language reinterpreted. What mattered was that they inspired devotion. And they did. But devotion was not their only effect. They also cultivated introspection, awe without explanation, a sense that something vast and ordered existed beyond doctrine. For centuries, people entered these spaces and felt something they could not name. They attributed it to God as they had been taught. But the experience itself did not require theology to function. It required structure. This is how the Templars may have ensured survival without continuity. They did not preserve their order. They preserved a way of shaping experience. When later thinkers, scientists, philosophers, architects began questioning inherited doctrines, they did so in a world already shaped by these spaces. A world where proportion, balance, and light had quietly trained the human mind to expect order rather than chaos. The cathedrals taught people to feel harmony before they could explain it. That lesson mattered. By the time the Renaissance arrived, Europe was ready to rediscover ancient knowledge not as pagan threat, but as intellectual inheritance. Geometry returned. Astronomy revived. The universe became intelligible again. This shift did not begin with books. It began with stone. The Templars did not need to survive as an institution to influence history. They needed only to plant ideas where they could not be easily uprooted. In walls, in arches, in spaces where silence spoke louder than words. The cathedrals stand today as monuments not just to faith, but to continuity, the quiet survival of ideas that outlived the men who carried them. Their builders may have forgotten the original source of their knowledge, or perhaps they never knew it fully themselves. But the structures they left behind continue to do what they were always meant to do. They align, they balance, they remind those who enter them that beneath belief, beneath authority, beneath fear, there is order. An order once felt cannot be entirely forgotten. That may be the greatest legacy the Templars ever left behind. Not a treasure hidden in vaults, but a way of seeing the world that could survive even their destruction. Written patiently in stone. When the fires died down and the trials faded into memory, a strange problem remained for those who had destroyed the Knights Templar. Too many of them had vanished. Official records insist that the order was dismantled completely. Properties seized. Brothers imprisoned or absorbed into other monastic orders. The narrative is tidy, reassuring, final. But history is rarely tidy, and this story is no exception. Across Europe, and especially beyond the reach of the French crown, evidence suggests that the Templars did not simply disappear. They dispersed. Scotland emerges again and again in this aftermath, not as a dramatic refuge filled with banners and secret councils, but as something far subtler, a place where the pressure of authority weakened just enough for silence to be possible. At the time of the Templars' destruction, Scotland was in open conflict with England. Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated by the Church, placing the entire kingdom in a kind of spiritual exile. Papal decrees held less power there. French royal authority held none. This mattered. An outlawed order could not easily find sanctuary in lands tightly bound to Rome and Paris. But Scotland existed in a legal and religious gray zone. The rules that destroyed the Templars elsewhere did not apply with the same force. Contemporary records from Scotland are sparse, but absence can be revealing. Unlike in France, there are no mass arrests of Templars, no public trials, no systematic confiscation of Templar lands. Properties once associated with the order continue to function quietly, often passing into the hands of families with no obvious connection to the Church. This quiet transition stands in stark contrast to the chaos elsewhere. Legends soon followed. Stories of Templars fighting alongside Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn, of knights in white cloaks appearing at crucial moments, turning the tide of battle. These tales are often dismissed as romantic invention, and perhaps they are. But legends do not arise without emotional truth. They arise when people sense continuity beneath disruption. More compelling than battlefield myths is the architectural and symbolic evidence that appears in Scotland after the fall of the Templars. Carvings, layouts, and motifs begin to surface that echo Templar and earlier initiatory symbolism. Stonework incorporates geometric patterns that do not align neatly with standard medieval Christian iconography. These details are quiet, easy to overlook, but they suggest transmission. Transmission does not require survival of an order. It requires survival of people. Templars who escaped arrest would not have traveled openly. They would have abandoned their habits, their titles, their public identities. But they would not have abandoned their training. Discipline does not dissolve when a uniform is removed. If these men found refuge among sympathetic families, clans, or guilds, they could pass on methods, not manifestos. Ways of organizing. Ways of thinking, ways of reading symbols and space. This is how initiatory traditions survive periods of suppression. They go underground. Scotland's later cultural developments offer intriguing parallels. The emergence of Freemasonry in its speculative form is often traced to Scotland, centuries after the Templars' fall. The connection is frequently exaggerated or oversimplified, but the continuity of symbolic language is difficult to ignore. Freemasonry emphasizes geometry, moral discipline, symbolic tools, and staged initiation. It speaks in allegory rather than doctrine. It values silence, self-improvement, and the idea that truth is revealed progressively, not declared outright. These principles do not belong to medieval Christianity. They belong to older traditions. Whether or not the Templars directly influenced Freemasonry is less important than the fact that the intellectual soil was receptive. Scotland preserved a cultural tolerance for symbolic systems operating outside strict church control. Knowledge could be framed as craft rather than heresy. Geometry could be taught as building skill rather than cosmic philosophy. This framing was protective. The Templars, if they survived in any form, would have understood the value of such camouflage. Silence becomes survival strategy. The absence of confessions, texts, or explicit claims after the fall is not evidence of disappearance. It is evidence of adaptation. Groups that survive persecution learn not to announce themselves. They learn to embed. Over generations, explicit memory fades. What remains are practices, symbols whose origins are forgotten. Stories that no longer have a clear source but still feel important. Scotland is filled with such remnants. Carved stones depicting unfamiliar imagery. Chapels whose layouts defy simple explanation. Families whose traditions hint at something older than recorded history. None of this proves an unbroken Templar order. It suggests something more resilient. A way of thinking survived. The Templars' greatest strength was never their military might. It was their discipline, their ability to operate quietly, to coordinate without spectacle, to value structure over display. These qualities translate well into survival under pressure. Unlike other outlawed groups, the Templars did not need to preserve hierarchy. They needed only to preserve principles. Hierarchy can be rebuilt. Principles once lost are harder to recover. The Church's attempt to destroy the Templars assumed that authority resided in institutions. Destroy the institution and the threat vanishes. This assumption was flawed. Institutions are fragile. Ideas are not. The Templars may have understood this long before their enemies did. Their refusal to fight back openly, their acceptance of dissolution, their silence under accusation, all suggest a long view, a willingness to sacrifice the visible in order to protect the invisible. Scotland offered the conditions necessary for this strategy to succeed. It was remote, politically fragmented, spiritually marginalized. It valued loyalty to clan over loyalty to distant authority. Knowledge passed through families and trades rather than universities and pulpits. In such an environment, ancient symbolic systems could persist without attracting fatal attention. Over time, the fear that once surrounded the Templars faded. The name became legend. The accusations became distant echoes. What remained were practices stripped of their original narrative. This stripping was not loss. It was concealment. When symbols are detached from their history, they become safe. When practices are framed as tradition rather than revelation, they avoid scrutiny. The deeper meaning survives beneath the surface, available only to those who learn how to look. This may have been the Templars' final and most successful act. They did not escape as knights. They escaped as silence. The idea that the order survived intact, plodding across centuries, is tempting but unnecessary. Survival does not require continuity of command. It requires continuity of understanding. A worldview rooted in structure, balance, and symbolic transmission does not need an organization to persist. It needs practitioners, men trained to value restraint over expression, knowledge over proclamation, preparation over conversion. Such men would not announce their lineage. They would simply continue, and that continuation, slow and almost invisible, would influence the future more effectively than any rebellion or revelation ever could. By the time the modern world emerged, the Templars were long gone as a name. But the methods they embodied, systemic thinking, symbolic communication, disciplined secrecy, had become foundational to new institutions. Science, finance, architecture, fraternal orders, all value structure, all distrust spectacle, all operate best when understood by few and used by many. If the Templars did survive, it was not as an army or a church. They survived as a pattern, one that learned how to move through history without leaving footprints. And in doing so, they ensured that whatever they had once discovered beneath ancient stones would not be lost to time, only deferred, waiting for an age capable of recognizing it again. By the time Freemasonry begins to appear clearly in historical records, the world has changed. The medieval order has fractured. The authority of the Church is no longer absolute. Science is stirring. Exploration is reshaping humanity's understanding of the planet. Yet beneath these visible changes runs a quieter current, one that feels strangely familiar. Freemasonry does not announce itself as a religion. It does not claim revelation. It offers no salvation, no dogma, no single God to worship. Instead, it speaks in symbols, teaches through allegory. It emphasizes moral discipline, self-knowledge, geometry, and the slow, deliberate refinement of the individual. This alone sets it apart from most institutions of its time. Its language is architectural. Tools become metaphors. The square teaches morality. The compass teaches restraint. The plumb line teaches integrity. Knowledge is not handed down as doctrine, but unlocked progressively through stages of initiation. Truth is not declared. It is earned. This structure immediately raises questions. Why architecture? Why geometry? Why initiation instead of instruction? These are not arbitrary choices. They reflect a way of transmitting knowledge that predates universities, churches, and modern science. They reflect initiatory tradition. Freemasonry insists that wisdom cannot be taught directly. It must be experienced, understood through symbol, silence, and repetition. Each degree reveals not answers, but deeper questions. The initiate is expected to work internally, interpreting meaning rather than receiving it. This is profoundly unchristian in the medieval sense. The Church taught through authority. Freemasonry teaches through introspection. The Church demands belief. Freemasonry demands effort. And yet, Freemasonry emerges in a Europe that has supposedly eradicated mystery traditions. This is the puzzle. Where did this symbolic language come from? There is no credible evidence of an unbroken, formal line between the Knights Templar and Freemasonry. No documents proving direct succession. No signed charters. No official transfer of authority. But direct succession is not how initiatory knowledge survives. It survives through migration. The operative Masons who built Europe's cathedrals already worked within a symbolic framework. Geometry was sacred to them, not merely practical. Proportion carried meaning. Tools were more than instruments, they were extensions of cosmic order. These builders did not invent this worldview. They inherited it. When cathedral building declined and operative Masonry faded, something unusual happened. The symbols remained, but the craft shifted inward. Masonry became speculative. Tools became metaphors rather than necessities. The lodge became a space not for building structures, but for building people. This transition did not happen by accident. It happened because the symbolic system was more durable than the trade that carried it. The resemblance between Masonic symbolism and earlier traditions is striking. Egyptian sacred geometry, Platonic philosophy, biblical allegory, medieval guild secrecy, all coexist within Masonic ritual without contradiction. This eclecticism suggests synthesis rather than invention. And synthesis requires a long memory. The Knights Templar, if they influenced this process at all, would not have done so as rulers or commanders. They would have done so as carriers, men trained to think symbolically, to value silence, to preserve knowledge through structure rather than proclamation. Their experience in the East exposed them to traditions that treated architecture, geometry, and initiation as sacred sciences. Their suppression forced them to abandon overt identity. What remained was method. Method travels easily. Freemasonry's insistence on secrecy has often been misunderstood. It is not secrecy of content. Many rituals are now publicly available. It is secrecy of interpretation. Symbols are meaningless without context, and context is earned through participation. This mirrors ancient mystery schools precisely. In Egypt, Greece, and later Hellenistic traditions, initiates were not told truths. They were led through experiences designed to awaken insight. Words were insufficient. Silence was essential. Freemasonry preserves this logic intact. Its God, often referred to as the great architect of the universe, is deliberately undefined. Members of different faiths are welcome, provided they acknowledge some higher principle of order. This abstraction is not accidental. It is philosophical. A God defined too precisely becomes sectarian. A God understood as order becomes universal. This concept aligns far more closely with ancient sacred science than with medieval theology. The Church could tolerate Freemasonry only when it appeared harmless, social, or philanthropic. When it seemed to challenge authority, by encouraging independent thought, moral autonomy, or symbolic reinterpretation, it was condemned. This pattern is familiar. Institutions built on control-fear systems that cultivate understanding. Freemasonry does not tell its members what to think. It teaches them how to think symbolically. It trains them to recognize patterns, balance opposites, and refine themselves through disciplined effort. These were precisely the qualities that made the Templars dangerous. Not because they rebelled, but because they did not need permission. The continuity between Templars and Freemasonry, then, is not a lineage of names or offices. It is a continuity of posture toward knowledge. A shared belief that truth is layered, that symbols are safer than statements, and that the unprepared should not be forced to confront ideas they cannot yet integrate. This approach is often mistaken for elitism. It is more accurately described as responsibility. Ancient traditions understood that knowledge reshapes identity. To give it indiscriminately is to destabilize both individuals and societies. Initiation is not about exclusion. It is about readiness. Freemasonry retains this ethic. Its degrees are not ranks of power, but stages of comprehension. Advancement requires reflection, not loyalty. Moral failure halts progress more effectively than ignorance. This emphasis would have felt deeply familiar to anyone shaped by initiatory systems long before Christianity defined itself through creed. If the Templars played a role in preserving this worldview, it would have been indirect but profound. Their fall demonstrated the danger of visible power paired with invisible knowledge. Their survival strategy, diffusion rather than defense, allowed ideas to persist without becoming targets. By the time Freemasonry crystallized into recognizable form, the Templars were safely buried in history. Their name evoked romance and conspiracy, not threat. This distance was protective. Ideas survive best when divorced from the trauma that once surrounded them. Freemasonry became a vessel broad enough to carry ancient principles without declaring their origin. It framed knowledge as moral improvement, geometry as metaphor, and initiation as self-work rather than revelation. This framing was acceptable to an emerging modern world. And yet, the core remained unchanged. Truth is not handed down. It is built, stone by stone, symbol by symbol, silence by silence. Whether or not the Templars consciously shaped Freemasonry matters less than the fact that both operate within the same philosophical ecosystem. One did so openly until it was destroyed. The other did so quietly, adapting to a world no longer ruled by a single authority. The Church lost its monopoly. Kings lost their divine right. Science began to question inherited truths. In such a world, symbolic systems thrived. Freemasonry did not replace religion. It bypassed it. It offered a framework for meaning that did not depend on dogma, but on discipline. That did not demand belief, but effort. That did not promise salvation, but transformation. These are ancient promises, older than Christianity, older than Europe, older even than the Templars. If the Templars' legacy survived anywhere, it survived not in hidden vaults or secret orders, but in this method, this patient, restrained way of carrying knowledge forward without challenging the world before it was ready. Freemasonry did not inherit the Templars' power. It inherited their caution. And that may be the most important inheritance of all. If there was one idea that the Knights Templar could never speak aloud, one truth that could not be written, preached, or defended without tearing the medieval world apart, it was not a denial of God or a rival theology. It was something far more unsettling. It was the idea that divine authority did not reside in institutions at all. According to ancient sacred science, the universe was governed by laws that operated regardless of belief. Order existed whether humans acknowledged it or not. Harmony could be discovered, not granted. Truth was not bestowed by decree, it was recognized through understanding. This idea shifts the center of gravity inward. If reality operates according to discoverable principles, then human beings are not helpless subjects awaiting salvation. They are participants capable of alignment. Morality becomes structural rather than commanded. Spiritual growth becomes a matter of refinement rather than obedience. This concept is subtle, but its implications are revolutionary. It does not abolish religion. It outgrows it. Religions become training systems, frameworks designed to stabilize societies and guide behavior at particular stages of development. But they are not final. They are scaffolding. To medieval Christianity, this was an existential threat. The Church claimed exclusive authority over salvation. It mediated between humanity and God. Its power depended on the belief that divine truth flowed downward, from heaven to priest, from priest to people. The idea that truth could be discovered independently collapsed this hierarchy. If the Templars had encountered fragments of this worldview, through architecture, symbolism, or ancient texts, they would have understood immediately why it could not be revealed. It was not heretical because it opposed Christianity. It was heretical because it made Christianity optional. This is the secret that could not be spoken. It reframed God not as a ruler, but as order itself. Not a being who commands, but a reality that responds. Actions produce consequences not because they offend a deity, but because they disrupt balance. This worldview does not threaten morality. It threatens control. Kings rule by divine sanction. Churches rule by spiritual mediation. Both collapse if authority shifts to understanding rather than obedience. The Templars' behavior suggests they may have accepted this shift quietly. Their discipline was internal, not imposed. Their loyalty was structural, not emotional. Their silence was not ignorance. It was restraint. They lived as if alignment mattered more than belief. This would explain why they did not seek converts, why they did not preach reform, why they did not write doctrine. They did not need others to agree with them. Agreement is irrelevant to reality. What mattered was preservation. Ancient traditions always recognized that certain ideas are dangerous not because they are false, but because they are true at the wrong time. Societies unprepared for self-responsibility respond to such truths with chaos. The Templars may have seen medieval Europe clearly. Violent, hierarchical, insecure. A world dependent on external authority to maintain order. To remove that authority suddenly would not liberate, it would destabilize. So they chose silence. Silence is not cowardice in initiatory systems. It is discipline. The truth they guarded was not a doctrine, but a perspective. That the divine is not offended by doubt, not appeased by ritual, not impressed by obedience. The divine is order, and order responds to understanding. This perspective changes everything. Prayer becomes alignment rather than petition. Sin becomes imbalance rather than offense. Salvation becomes growth rather than rescue. These ideas appear again and again in mystical traditions across cultures. They surface in moments of insight, then recede when institutions reassert control. They are tolerated only so long as they remain marginal. The Templars may have found themselves custodians of this perspective in a world that could not accommodate it. Their enemies accused them of denying Christ. But perhaps what they denied was not Christ, but exclusivity. They may have seen Christ not as the only path, but as one expression of a universal principle, an archetype of alignment between human and divine. Such a view honors Christ symbolically while undermining the Church's monopoly. This is why the accusations were so confused. Inquisitors sensed deviation but could not articulate it. The Templars did not worship a different God. They simply did not require mediation in the same way. The Church had no category for this. Either one obeys or one rebels. Either one believes or one denies. There was no language for transcending the framework entirely. So transcendence was labeled heresy. The Templars' destruction ensured that this perspective would not spread openly. But destruction does not erase understanding. It forces adaptation. The secret was never meant to be revealed publicly. It was meant to survive. Survival required fragmentation. The idea could not exist as a single doctrine or institution. It had to dissolve into symbols, methods, and intuitions scattered across culture. This scattering made it safe. Over centuries, fragments resurfaced in different contexts. In science, where the universe became intelligible. In philosophy, where reason challenged authority. In mysticism, where direct experience bypassed doctrine. Each fragment appeared harmless on its own. Together, they reshaped the world. The Templars may have recognized this long arc. They may have understood that their role was not to change their own time, but to ensure that future times would have access to alternative ways of seeing. This is not martyrdom. It is stewardship. Stewardship of an idea that does not belong to any one culture or religion. An idea that predates temples and will outlive them. The idea that reality can be known. Not fully, not completely, but enough to align with it consciously. This alignment does not require belief. It requires attention. Attention is dangerous. A population trained to pay attention, to patterns, consequences, structures, is difficult to control through fear or spectacle. Such people ask questions. They test claims. They demand coherence. Medieval power structures depended on obedience, not coherence. The Templars, if they embodied this perspective, would have been intolerable not because they were immoral, but because they were internally free. Freedom of this kind cannot be legislated, cannot be tortured out of existence, can only be delayed. The secret the Templars could not speak was not a formula or a ritual. It was an orientation toward reality, a way of standing in the world that makes external authority secondary. That orientation survives whenever someone values understanding over belief, whenever someone seeks alignment rather than permission, whenever someone recognizes that truth does not require enforcement. The Templars' silence preserved this possibility. They did not save themselves. They saved an idea, one that would resurface, again and again, quietly reshaping the world long after their names had turned to ash. And that is why the secret could never be spoken. Because once spoken, it would no longer be safe. And once heard by those unprepared, it would no longer be true. The destruction of the Knights Templar is often explained as an act of greed, a convenient conspiracy driven by a king's debts and a pope's weakness. Those factors mattered, but they are not enough. Greed does not usually require such total annihilation. Debts can be renegotiated. Rivals can be weakened without being erased. What happened to the Templars was not containment. It was eradication. That level of response suggests fear, not of rebellion, but of destabilization. The Church did not merely fear what the Templars did. It feared what they represented. For centuries, the Church had positioned itself as the sole interpreter of divine truth. It did not simply teach morality. It defined reality. God spoke through Scripture as interpreted by clergy. Salvation flowed through sacraments administered by authorized hands. Meaning itself was regulated. This monopoly was not optional. Without it, the Church's authority collapsed. The Templars threatened this monopoly not by preaching openly against it, but by existing comfortably outside it. They were obedient on the surface, disciplined in behavior, orthodox in appearance. Yet they operated with an autonomy that unsettled both kings and priests. They did not seek approval. They did not ask permission. They behaved as though authority did not need constant reinforcement. This posture alone was dangerous. The Church could tolerate heretics who argued. Arguments can be crushed. Public dissent can be punished. What it could not tolerate was quiet divergence, people who no longer depended on the system but did not openly challenge it. Such people expose irrelevance. If the Templars had simply been corrupt or immoral, the Church would have reformed or replaced them. If they had merely been powerful, the Church would have negotiated. But the Church chose destruction because something deeper was at stake. The Templars embodied a way of relating to the sacred that bypassed mediation. Their discipline was inward. Their loyalty was structural. Their silence suggested that truth did not need constant defense. This implied a worldview in which divine order existed independently of institutional enforcement. That implication was catastrophic. The medieval Church functioned as both spiritual guide and social stabilizer. It told people not only how to worship, but how to live, fear, hope, and obey. Remove the assumption that the Church was necessary for understanding reality, and the entire system unraveled. The Church had learned this lesson the hard way. Earlier movements that emphasized direct experience, Gnostics, mystics, reformers, had been condemned for the same reason. Not because they denied God, but because they relocated access to God. Access is power. To suggest that individuals could align themselves with truth through understanding, discipline, or experience was to render the Church advisory rather than essential. This was intolerable in a world where authority depended on exclusivity. The Templars, by their very existence, made this exclusivity fragile. Their financial independence demonstrated that power could operate without feudal hierarchy. Their military discipline showed that loyalty could exist without dynastic obligation. Their symbolic language suggested that meaning could be encoded outside official doctrine. Taken together, these qualities formed a quiet alternative. Not a rebellion, a redundancy. Institutions fear redundancy more than opposition. Opposition legitimizes power by acknowledging it. Redundancy renders power obsolete. The Church may not have fully understood what the Templars knew, but it understood enough to sense danger. The accusations leveled against them reflect this anxiety. They are less about specific beliefs and more about deviation from expected forms of reverence and submission. The Templars were accused of not behaving correctly before sacred symbols, of not expressing faith in approved ways, of treating holy objects differently than prescribed. These are not charges of disbelief. They are charges of reinterpretation. Reinterpretation undermines authority because it invites others to do the same. Once symbols become flexible, doctrine loses its grip. Once doctrine loses its grip, obedience must be enforced by force rather than belief. The Church had already seen where this led. Internal dissent fractured unity. Competing interpretations led to schism. Schism weakened control. Control, once weakened, invited chaos. From the Church's perspective, the Templars were not dangerous because they were wrong. They were dangerous because they were adaptable. Adaptability is fatal to rigid systems. The Church responded accordingly. It did not debate. It did not clarify. It did not seek reconciliation. It eliminated the anomaly. This elimination served multiple purposes. It reassured the faithful that deviation would not be tolerated. It reminded kings that the Church could still sanction destruction. And it erased a living example of autonomy that others might emulate. The irony is that by destroying the Templars, the Church revealed its own insecurity. A confident institution does not need to annihilate silence. The Church's fear was not abstract. There is a quiet possibility that unsettles historians more than any tale of hidden treasure or secret bloodlines. That the Knights Templar never intended for their knowledge to be recovered in full. Not lost by accident. Not stolen, but dispersed deliberately. This idea runs counter to the way modern minds approach secrecy. We imagine vaults, coded manuscripts, buried relics waiting to be uncovered. We imagine a single key that, once found, unlocks everything. But ancient initiatory traditions rarely worked this way. Complete systems were never entrusted to single locations, single texts, or single generations. They were broken apart on purpose. In Egyptian sacred science, knowledge was distributed across symbols, rituals, architecture, and behavior. No initiate ever received the whole picture at once. Understanding emerged only through years of exposure, discipline, and synthesis. This fragmentation was not a flaw. It was a safeguard. The Templars appear to have adopted the same strategy. If they truly believed that what they had encountered was dangerous in the wrong hands, not because it was evil, but because it was destabilizing, then the safest place for it was nowhere and everywhere at once. Not in a book that could be burned. Not in an object that could be seized. But in patterns. Patterns survive destruction. When the arrests began, the Templars had time. Perhaps not much, but enough. The order was disciplined, interconnected, and experienced in operating under pressure. They knew how to move assets quietly. They knew how to disappear. More importantly, they knew how to dissolve without collapsing. Dissolution was not failure. It was the final phase. Rather than attempting to preserve the order as a visible institution, they appear to have allowed it to fragment. Commanderies were abandoned. Personnel scattered. Responsibilities dissolved into local structures. What could be seized was left behind. What mattered was carried invisibly. This decision makes sense only if the goal was preservation rather than survival. An institution that survives intact becomes a target. An idea that disperses becomes a background condition. The Templars may have understood that their knowledge, whatever its exact form, could not be safely held by any single group. Centralization invites destruction. Fragmentation invites longevity. So they did what ancient custodians always did. They encoded. Some fragments went into architecture, proportions, alignments, spatial logic that could shape perception without explanation. Anyone could walk through a cathedral. Only a few would sense why it felt the way it did. Some fragments went into symbolism, crosses that balanced instead of bled, tools that taught ethics without doctrine, images that could be read as orthodox or subversive depending on who was looking. Some fragments went into method, discipline, silence, initiation, The idea that truth unfolds gradually and cannot be forced, that readiness matters more than belief. And some fragments went into people. Men trained to think structurally rather than emotionally, to value order over spectacle, to work quietly within systems instead of opposing them openly. These men did not need to remember where their ideas came from. They needed only to apply them. This is how knowledge survives when memory does not. By the time the Templars were officially dissolved, their enemies believed they had won. The order was gone, its name disgraced, its leaders executed, its properties redistributed. From the outside, the threat appeared neutralized. But the pattern suggests otherwise. After the fall, no single successor organization emerged. No unified underground movement announced itself. Instead, similar ideas surfaced independently in different places at different times under different names. This is not coincidence. It is what happens when a system has been intentionally scattered. Each fragment by itself appears harmless. Geometry without theology. Symbol without explanation. Discipline without doctrine. None of these threaten power alone. Together, they change how people see the world. The most effective way to protect dangerous knowledge is not to hide it, but to make it incomplete. To ensure that no one can weaponize it easily. To require synthesis across time, cultures, and disciplines. This requires patience. It assumes that future generations will be better equipped to integrate what earlier ones could not. The Templars may have made this calculation consciously. Medieval Europe was violent, hierarchical, and fragile. Authority was maintained through fear and ritual. Literacy was limited. Curiosity was suspect. A worldview that emphasized self-alignment, structural understanding, and internal authority would not liberate such a society. It would shatter it. So the knowledge was delayed, not erased, deferred. Fragments were allowed to drift forward in time, protected by obscurity and reinterpretation. By the time they reassembled in new forms, science, philosophy, modern architecture, systems thinking, the world had changed enough to absorb them. The Templars did not lose their secret. They postponed it. This also explains why modern attempts to recover Templar knowledge feel unsatisfying. Treasure hunts lead nowhere. Decoded symbols refuse to resolve into clear doctrine. Each discovery opens more questions than answers. That is not failure. That is design. A complete revelation would contradict the very principle the knowledge embodied. That understanding must be earned through synthesis, not received as inheritance. That truth is not static information, but a relationship between mind and reality. The Templars may have ensured that no single generation could ever claim ownership of what they preserved. Instead, each generation would encounter fragments suited to its level of development. This approach prevents corruption. Institutions inevitably reshape knowledge to serve power. Fragmentation resists this. No authority can monopolize what it does not fully possess. Even the Church, in destroying the Templars, unintentionally assisted this process. By scattering people, symbols, and practices, it accelerated diffusion. What could have remained concentrated became global. The irony is sharp. The very act meant to eliminate the threat ensured its survival. By the time the modern world began asking the kinds of questions the Templars may have encountered centuries earlier, about structure, consciousness, and the nature of reality, the knowledge was no longer associated with heresy. It appeared as science, as philosophy, as psychology, safe names, respectable fields, the same ideas stripped of religious threat. This suggests that the Templars were not merely victims of history. They were participants in a long strategy, not a conspiracy spanning centuries, but a recognition of how ideas move through time, how they must adapt to survive, how silence can be more powerful than proclamation. The secret was not that God did not exist, or that religion was false. The secret was that truth does not need protection by force. It needs time. By choosing not to reveal everything, by allowing their order to be destroyed rather than compromised, the Templars ensured that whatever they carried would not be frozen in the limitations of their era. They chose uncertainty over certainty, process over conclusion. This choice aligns perfectly with ancient initiatory ethics. Knowledge is not a possession. It is a responsibility. To reveal it prematurely is to betray it. So the Templars let history believe they failed. Failure is an excellent disguise. Centuries later, the world would begin rediscovering fragments on its own. Through inquiry, experimentation, and reflection. Each discovery would feel new, independent, earned. No single authority could claim authorship. No single doctrine could claim ownership. That is the mark of knowledge designed to survive. If the Templars truly wanted their secret to be found, they would have hidden it somewhere specific. If they wanted it to endure, they would have done exactly what appears to have happened. They would have made sure it was never fully lost, and never fully found. Not until humanity itself was ready to assemble the pieces, not as revelation, but as understanding. That possibility reframes their destruction entirely, not as an ending, but as a deliberate scattering, a quiet decision to trust the future more than their own time. And perhaps that trust, more than any relic or symbol, was the most radical act the Templars ever committed.